Chapter 19 of Venetian Life by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Lovemaking and Marrying, Baptisms and Burials. The Venetians have had a practical and strictly business-like way of arranging marriages from the earliest times. The shrewdest provision has always been made for the dower and for the good of the state. Private and public interest being consulted, the small matters of affections have been left to the chances of association, and it does not seem that Venetian society has ever dealt severely with husbands or wives, whom incompatibilities forced to seek consolation outside of matrimony. Herodotus relates that the Illyrian Veneti sold their daughters at auction to the highest bidder, and the fair being thus comfortably placed in life, the hard-favoured were given to whomsoever would take them, with such dower as might be considered a reasonable compensation. The auction was discontinued in Christian times, but marriage contracts still partook of the form of a public and half-mercantile transaction. At a comparatively late period, Venetian fathers went with their daughters to a great annual matrimonial fair at San Pietro Castello Olivolo, and the youth of the lagoons repaired thither to choose wives from the number of the maidens. These were all dressed in white, with hair loose about the neck, and each bore her dower in a little box slung over her shoulder by a ribbon. It is to be supposed that there was commonly a previous understanding between each damsel and some youth in the crowd. As soon as all had paired off, the bishop gave them a sermon and his benediction, and the young men gathered up their brides and boxes and went away wedded. It was on one of these occasions, in the year 944, that the Triestine pirates stole the brides of Venice with their dowers, and gave occasion to the Festa del Mari, already described, and to Roger's poem, which everybody pretends to have read. This going to San Pietro, selecting a wife and marrying her on the spot out of hand, could only have been the contrivance of a straightforward practical race. Among the common people, betrothals were managed with even greater ease and dispatch till a very late day in history, and in the record of a certain trial which took place in 1443, there is an account of one of these brief and unceremonious courtships. Donna Caterusa, who gives evidence, and whom I take to have been a worthless idle gossip, was one day sitting at her door, when Piero di Trento passed, selling brooms, and said to her, "Madonna, find me some nice girl." To which Donna Caterusa replied, "Ugly fool, do you take me for a go-between?" "No," said Piero, "not that. I mean a girl to be my wife." And as Donna Caterusa thought at once of a suitable match, she said, "In faith of God, I know one for you. Come again tomorrow." So they both met next day, and the woman chosen by Donna Caterusa being asked, "Would thou like to have Piero for thy husband, as God commands and Holy Church?" she answered yes, and Peter, being asked the like question, answered, "Why, yes, certainly," and they went off and had the wedding feast. A number of these betrothals takes place in the last scene of Goldini's Baruffe Chiazotte, where the belligerent women and their lovers take hands in the public streets, and, saluting each other as man and wife, are affianced, and get married as quickly as possible. Readers note what follows is a brief extract from a play. Quote, "Cecca, to follow, take my hand, to follow, wife, Cecca, husband, to follow, hurrah." The betrothals of the Venetian nobles were celebrated with as much pomp and ceremony as could possibly distinguish them from those of the people, and there was much more polite indifference to the inclinations of the parties immediately concerned. The contract was often concluded before the betrothed had seen each other by means of a third person, when the amount of the dower was fixed. The bridegroom-elect, having verbally agreed with the parents of the bride, repaired at an early day to the courtyard of the ducal palace, where the match was published, and where he shook hands with his kinsmen and friends. On the day fixed for signing the contract, the bride's father invited to his house the bridegroom and all his friends, and hither came the high officers of state to compliment the future husband. He, with the father of his betrothed, met the guests at the door of the palace, and conducted them to the grand saloon, which no woman was allowed, si figuri, at this time to enter. When the company was seated, the bride, clad in white, was led from her rooms and presented. She wore a crown of pearls and brilliants on her head, and her hair, mixed with long threads of gold, fell loose about her shoulders, as you may see in Carpaccio's pictures of the espousals of St. Ursula. Her earrings were pendants of 3 pearls set in gold. Her neck and throat were bare but for a collar of lace and gems, from which slid a fine jewelled chain into her bosom. Over her breast she wore a stomacher of cloth of gold, to which were attached her sleeves, open from the elbow to the hand. The formal words of espousal being pronounced, the bride paced slowly round the hall to the music of fifes and trumpets, and made a gentle inclination to each of the guests, and then returned to her chamber, from which she issued again on the arrival of any tardy friend, and repeated the ceremony. After all this, she descended to the courtyard, where she was received by gentlewomen, her friends, and placed on a raised seat, which was covered with rich stuffs, in an open gondola, and thus followed by a fleet of attendant gondolas, went to visit all the convents in which there were kinspeople of herself or her betrothed. The excessive publicity of these ceremonies was supposed to strengthen the validity of the marriage contract. At an early day after the espousals, the betrothed, preceded by musicians and followed by relatives and friends, went at dawn to be married in the church, the bridegroom wearing a toga, and the bride a dress of white silk or crimson velvet, with jewels in her hair and pearls embroidered on her robes. Visits of congratulation followed, and on the same day a public feast was given in honour of the wedding, to which at least 300 persons were always invited, and at which the number, quality, and cost of the dishes were carefully regulated by the Republic's laws. On this occasion, one or more persons were chosen as governors of the feast, and after the tables were removed, a mock heroic character appeared, and recounted with absurd exaggeration the deeds of the ancestors of the bride and groom. The next morning, restorativi of sweetmeats and confectionery were presented to the happy couple, by whom the presents were returned in kind. A splendour so exceptional, even in the most splendid age of the most splendid city, as that which marked the nuptial feasts of the unhappy Jacopo Foscari, could not be left unnoticed in this place. He espoused Lucrezia, daughter of Leonardo Contarini, a noble as rich and magnificent as Jacopo's own father, the Doge, and on the 29th of January, 1441, the noble Estachio Balbi being chosen lord of the feasts, the bridegroom, the bride's brother, and 18 other patrician youths assembled in the Palazzo Balbi, whence they went on horseback to conduct Lucrezia to the ducal palace. They were all sumptuously dressed in crimson velvet and silver brocade of Alexandria, and rode chargers superbly caparisoned. Other noble friends attended them, musicians went before, a troop of soldiers brought up the rear. They thus proceeded to the courtyard of the ducal palace, and then, returning, traversed the piazza, and threading the devious little streets to the Campo San Samuele, there crossed the Grand Canal upon a bridge of boats to San Barnaba opposite, where the Contarini lived. On their arrival at this place, the bride, supported by 2 procurati di San Marco, and attended by 60 ladies, descended to the church and heard mass, after which an oration was delivered in Campo San Barnaba, before the Doge, the ambassadors, and a multitude of nobles and people, in praise of the spouses and their families. The bride then returned to her father's house, and jousts took place in the Campos of Santa Maria Formosa and San Polo, the largest in the city, and in the Piazza San Marco. The Doge gave a great banquet, and at its close 150 ladies proceeded to the bride's palace in the Bucentoro, where 100 other ladies joined them, together with Lucrezia, who, seated between Francesco Sforza, then General-in-Chief of the Republic's armies, and the Florentine ambassador, was conducted amid the shouts of the people and the sound of trumpets to the ducal palace. The Doge received her at the Riva of the Piazzetta, and with Sforza and Balbi led her to the foot of the palace stairs, where the Dogeressa, with 60 ladies, welcomed her. A state supper ended this day's rejoicings, and on the following day a tournament took place in the piazza for a prize of cloth of gold, which was offered by Sforza. 40 knights contested the prize and supped afterwards with the Doge. On the next day there were processions of boats with music on the Grand Canal. On the 4th and last day there were other jousts for prizes offered by the jewellers and Florentine merchants, and every night there were dancing and feasting in the ducal palace. The Doge was himself the giver of the last tournament, and with this the festivities came to an end. I have read an account by an old-fashioned English traveller of a Venetian marriage which he saw 60 or 70 years ago at the church of San Giorgio Maggiore. After a crowd of nobles, he says, in their usual black robes, had been some time in attendance, the gondolas appearing, exhibited a fine show, though all of them were painted of a sable hue, in consequence of a sumptuary law which is very necessary in this place to prevent an expense which many who could not bear it would incur. Nevertheless, the barcarioli, or boatmen, were dressed in handsome liveries. The gondolas followed one another in line, each carrying 2 ladies, who were likewise dressed in black. As they landed, they arranged themselves in order, forming a line from the gate to the great altar. At length the bride, arrayed in white as the symbol of innocence, led by the bridesmen, ascended the stairs of the landing place. There she received the compliments of the bridegroom in his black toga, who walked at her right hand to the altar, where they and all the company kneeled. I was often afraid the poor young creature would have sunk upon the ground before she arrived, for she trembled with great agitation, while she made her low courtesies from side to side. However, the ceremony was no sooner performed than she seemed to recover her spirits, and looked matrimony in the face with a determined smile. Indeed, in all appearance, she had nothing to fear from her husband, whose age and aspect were not at all formidable. Accordingly, she tripped back to the gondola with great activity and resolution, and the procession ended as it began. Though there was something attractive in this aquatic parade, the black hue of the boats and the company presented to a stranger like me the idea of a funeral rather than a wedding. My expectation was raised too high by a previous description of the Italians, who are much given to hyperbole, who gave me to understand that this procession would far exceed anything I had ever seen. When I reflect upon this rhodomontade, disdainfully adds Mr. Drummond, I cannot help comparing in my memory the paltry procession of the Venetian marriage with a very august occurrence, of which I was eyewitness in Sweden, and which, being the reception of their Swedish Majesties by the British fleet, I am sure the reader will not ask me to quote. With change of government, changes of civilization following the revolutions, and the decay of wealth among the Venetian nobles, almost all their splendid customs have passed away, and the habit of making wedding presents of sweetmeats and confectionery is perhaps the only relic which has descended from the picturesque past to the present time. These gifts are still exchanged not only by nobles, but by all commoners according to their means, and are sometimes a source of very profuse outlay. It is the habit to send the candies in the elegant and costly paper caskets, which the confectioners sell, and the sum of 1,000 florins scarcely suffices to pass the courtesy round a moderately large circle of friends. With the nobility and with the richest commoners, marriage is still greatly a matter of contract, and is arranged without much reference to the principals, though it is now scarcely probable in any case that they have not seen each other. But with all other classes except the poorest, who cannot and do not seclude the youth of either sex from each other, and with whom, consequently, romantic contrivance and subterfuge would be superfluous, love is made today in Venice, as in the Capa e Espada comedies of the Spaniards, and the business is carried on with all the cumbrous machinery of confidence, billet doux, and stolen interviews. Let us take our nominal friends Marco and Todaro, and attend them in their solemn promenade under the arcades of the Procurati, or upon the Molo, whither they go every evening to taste the air and to look at the ladies, while the Austrians and the other foreigners listen to the military music in the piazza. They are both young, our friends, they have both glossy silk hats, they have both light canes and an innocent swagger. Inconceivably mild are these youth, and in their talk indescribably small and commonplace. They look at the ladies, and suddenly Todaro feels the consuming ardours of love. Todaro to Marco. Here, dear, behold this beautiful blonde here, beautiful as an angel. But what loveliness! Marco. But where? Todaro. It is enough, let us go, I follow her. Such is the force of passion in southern hearts. They follow that beautiful blonde, who, marching demurely in front of the grey-moustached papa and the fat mamma, after the fashion in Venice, is electrically conscious of pursuit. They follow her during the whole evening, and at a distance softly follow her home, where the burning Todaro photographs the number of the house upon the sensitized tablets of his soul. This is the first great step in love. He has seen his adored one, and he knows that he loves her with an inextinguishable ardour. The next advance is to be decided between himself and the faithful Marco, and is to be debated over many cups of black coffee, not to name glasses of sugar and water, and like exciting beverages. The friends may now find out the cafe which the Biondina frequents with her parents, and to which Todaro may go every evening and feast his eyes upon her loveliness, never making his regard known by any word, till some night, when he has followed her home, he steals speech with her as he stands in the street under her balcony, and looks sufficiently sheepish as people detect him on their late return from the theatre. Footnote: the love-making scenes in Goldini's comedy of Il Bugiardo are photographically faithful to present usage in Venice. Footnote ends. Or if the friends do not take this course in their courtship, for they are both engaged in the wooing, they decide that Todaro, after walking back and forth a sufficient number of times in the street where Biondina lives, shall write her a tender letter to demand, if she be disposed to correspond his love. This billet must always be conveyed to her by her serving maid, who must be bribed by Marco for the purpose. At every juncture Marco must be consulted and acquainted with every step of the progress, and no doubt Biondina has some lovely Moretta for her friend, to whom she confides her part of the love affair in all its intricacy. It may likewise happen that Tadaro shall go to see the Biondina in church, whither, but for her presence, he would hardly go, and that there, though he may not have speech with her, he shall still fan the ardours of her curiosity and pity by persistent sighs. It must be confessed that if the Biondina is not pleased with his looks, his devotion must assume the character of an intolerable bore to her, and that to see him everywhere at her heels, to behold him leaning against the pillar near where she kneels at church, the head of his stick in his mouth, and his attitude carefully taken with a view to captivation, to always be in deadly fear lest she shall meet him in promenade, or turning round at the café, encounter his pleading gaze, that all this must drive the Biondina to a state bordering upon blasphemy and fingernails. Ma comme si fa? Si vous pensienza? This is the sole course open to the ingenuous youth in Venice, where confessed and unashamed acquaintance between young people is extremely difficult, and so this blind pursuit must go on till the Biondina's inclinations are at last laboriously ascertained. Suppose the Biondina consents to be loved. Then Tadaro has just and proper inquiries to make concerning her dower, and if her fortune is as pleasing as herself, he has only to demand her in marriage of her father, and after that to make her acquaintance. One day a Venetian friend of mine, who spoke a little English, came to me with a joyous air and said, "I am in love." The recipient of repeated confidences of this kind from the same person, I listened with tempered effusion. "Is it a blonde again?" "Yes, you have right, blonde again." "And pretty?" "Oh, but beautiful. I love her. Come si dice. Immensamente." "And where did you see her? Where did you make her acquaintance?" "I have not make the acquaintance. I see her pass with her father every night on Rialto Bridge. We did not speak yet, only with the eyes. The lady is not of Venice. She has 4,000 florins. It is not much, no, but... Is not this love at first sight almost idyllic? Is it not also a sublime prudence to know the lady's fortune better than herself before herself? These passionate, headlong Italians look well to the main chance before they leap into matrimony, and you may be sure Tadaro knows in black and white what the Biondina has to her fortune before he weds her. After that may come the marriage, and the sonnet written by the next of friendship, and printed to hang up in all the shop windows, celebrating the auspicious event. If he be rich or can write nobili after his Christian name, perhaps some abate, elegantly addicted to verses and alive to grateful consequences, may publish a poem, elegantly printed by the matchless printers at Rovigo, and send it to all the bridegroom's friends. It is not the only event which the facile Venetian muse shall sing for him. If his child is brought happily through the measles by Dottor Cavasangue, the nine shall celebrate the fact. If he takes any public honour or scholastic degree, it is equal occasion for verses, and when he dies, the mortuary rhyme shall follow him. Indeed, almost every occurrence, a boy's success at school, an advocate's triumphal passage of the perils of examination at Padua, a priest's first mass, a nun's novitiate, a birth, an amputation, is the subject of tuneful effusion, and no less the occasion of a visit from the Facchini of the neighbouring Campo, who assemble with blare of trumpets and tumult of voices around the victim's door, and proclaim his skill or good fortune, and break into vivas that never end till he bribes their enthusiasm into silence. The naive commonplaceness of feeling in all matrimonial transactions, in spite of the gloss which the operatic methods of courtship threw about them, was a source of endless amusement, as it stole out in different ways. "You know my friend Marco?" asked an acquaintance one day. "Well, we are looking out a wife for him. He doesn't want to marry, but his father insists, and he has begged us to find somebody. There are 3 of us on the lookout, but he hates women and is very hard to suit. Then, ci vuole pazienza." It rarely happens now that the religious part of the marriage ceremony is not performed in church, although it may be performed at the house of the bride. In this case, it usually takes place in the evening, and the spouses attend 5 o'clock Mass next morning. But if the marriage takes place at church, it must be between 5 and 11 in the morning, and the blessing is commonly pronounced about 6 o'clock. Civil marriage is still unknown among the Venetians. It is entirely the affair of the church, in which the banns are published beforehand, and which extracts from the candidates a preliminary visit to their parish priest for examination in their catechism, and for instruction in religion when they are defective in knowledge of the kind. There is no longer any civil publication of the betrothals, and the handshaking in the court of the ducal palace has long been disused. I cannot help thinking that the ceremony must have been a great affliction, and that in the republican times at Venice a bridegroom must have fared nearly as hard as a president-elect in our own times at home. There was a curious display on occasion of births among the nobility in former times. The room of the young mother was decorated with a profusion of paintings, sculpture, and jewellery, and while yet in bed she received the congratulations of her friends and regaled them with sweetmeats served in vases of gold and silver. The child of noble parents had always at least 2 godfathers, and sometimes as many as 150, but in order that the relationship of godfather, which is the same according to canonical law as a tie of consanguinity, should not prevent desirable matrimony between nobles, no patrician was allowed to be godfather to another's child. Consequently, the compere was usually a client of the noble parent, and was not expected to make any present to the godchild whose father, on the day following the baptism, sent him a piece of marchpane in acknowledgment of their relationship. No women were present at the baptism except those who had charge of the babe. After the fall of the Republic, the French custom of baptism in the parent's house was introduced, as well as the custom, on the godfather's part, of giving a present, usually of sugar plums and silver toys. But I think that most baptisms still take place in church, if I may judge from the numbers of tight little glass cases I have noticed, half bed and half coffin, containing little 8-day-old Venetians, closely swaddled in mummy-like bandages, and borne to and from the churches by mysterious old women. The ceremony of baptism itself does not apparently differ from that in other Catholic countries, and is performed, like all religious services in Italy, without a ray of religious feeling or solemnity of any kind. For many centuries, funeral services in Venice have been conducted by the Schule del Sacramento, instituted for that purpose. To one of these societies, the friends of the defunct pay a certain sum, and the association engages to inter the dead and bear all the expenses of the ceremony, the dignity of which is regulated by the priest of the parish in which the deceased lived. The rite is now most generally undertaken by the Scuola di San Rocco. The funeral train is of 10 or 20 facchini, wearing tunics of white with caps and capes of red, and bearing the society's long gilded candlesticks of wood with lighted tapers. Priests follow them, chanting prayers, and then comes the bier, with a gilt crown lying on the coffin, if the dead be a babe, to indicate the triumph of innocence. Formerly, the hired mourners attended, and a candle weighing £1 was given to any who chose to carry it in the procession. Anciently, there was great show of mourning in Venice for the dead, when, according to Mutinelli, the friends and kinsmen of the deceased, having seen his body deposited in the church, fell to weeping and howling, tore their hair and rent their clothes, and withdrew for ever from that church, thenceforth become for them a place of abomination. Decenter customs prevailed in after times, and there was a pathetic dignity in the ceremony of condolence among patricians. The mourners, on the day following the interment, repaired to the porticos of Rialto and the court of the ducal palace, and their friends came one after one and expressed their sympathy by a mute pressure of the hand. Death, however, is hushed up as much as possible in modern Venice. The corpse is hurried from the house of mourning to the parish church, where the friends, after the funeral service, take leave of it. Then it is placed in a boat and carried to the burial ground, where it is quickly interred. I was fortunate, therefore, in witnessing a cheerful funeral, at which I one day casually assisted at San Michele. There was a church on this island as early as the 10th century, and in the 13th century it fell into the possession of the Commandelensen friars. They built a monastery on it, which became famous as a seat of learning, and gave much erudite scholarship to the world. In later times, Pope Gregory XVI carried his profound learning from San Michele to the Vatican. The present church is in the Renaissance style, but not very offensively so, and has some indifferent paintings. The arcades and the courts around which it is built contain funeral monuments as unutterably ugly and tasteless as anything of the kind I ever saw at home, but the dead for the most part lie in graves marked merely by little iron crosses, in the narrow and roofless space walled in from the lagoon, which laps sluggishly at the foot of the masonry with the impulses of the tide. The old monastery was abolished in 1810, and there is now a convent of reformed Benedictines on the island who perform the last service for the dead. On the day of which I speak, I was taking a friend to see the objects of interest at San Michele, which I had seen before, and the funeral procession touched at the riva of the church just as we arrived. The procession was of one gondola only, and the pallbearers were 4 pleasant ruffians in scarlet robes of cotton, hooded and girdled at the waist. They were accompanied by a priest of a broad and jolly countenance, 2 grinning boys, and finally the corpse itself, severely habited in an underdress of black box, but wearing an outer garment of red velvet, bordered and tasselled gaily. The pleasant ruffians, who all wore smoking caps with some other name, placed this holiday corpse upon a bier, and after a lively dispute with our gondolier, in which the compliments of the day were passed in the usual terms of Venetian chaff, lifted the bier on shore and set it down. The priest followed with the 2 boys, whom he rebuked for levity, simultaneously tripping over the Latin of a prayer, with his eyes fixed on our harmless little party, as if we were a funeral, and the dead in the black box an indifferent spectator. Then he popped down upon his knees and made us a lively little supplication, while the blind beggar scuffled for a lost soldo about his feet, and the gondoliers quarrelled volubly. After which he threw off his surplice with the air of one who should say his day's work was done, and proceeded the coffin into the church. We had hardly deposited the bier upon the floor in the centre of the nave, when 2 pale young friars appeared, throwing off their hooded cloaks of coarse brown, as they passed to the sacristy, and reappearing in their rope-girdled gowns. One of them bore a lighted taper in his right hand and a book in his left, the other also a taper, but a pot of holy water instead of the book. They are very handsome young men, these monks, with heavy, sad eyes and graceful, slender figures, which their monastic life will presently overload with gross humanity full of coarse appetites. They go and stand beside the bier, giving a curious touch of solemnity to a scene composed of the 4 pleasant ruffians in the loaferish postures which they have learned as facchini waiting for jobs, of the 2 boys with inattentive grins, and of the priest with wandering eyes kneeling behind them. A weak, thin-voiced organ pipes huskily from its damp loft. The monk hurries rapidly over the Latin text of the service, while his breath to heaven like vapour goes on the chilly, humid air. And the other monk makes the responses, giving and taking the sprinkler, which his chief shakes vaguely in the direction of the coffin. They both bow their heads, shaven down to the temples, to simulate his crown of thorns. Silence. The organ is still, the priest has vanished. The tapers are blown out, the pallbearers lay hold of the bier and raise it to their shoulders. The boys slouch into procession behind them, the monks glide softly and dispiritedly away. The soul is prepared for eternal life, and the body for the grave. The ruffians are expansively gay on reaching the open air again. They laugh, they call ciao continually, and banter each other as they trot to the grave. Footnote, literally, that in Italian, and meaning in Venetian, you, hey. To talk in ciao ciapa is to assume insolent familiarity or unbounded good fellowship with the person addressed. A Venetian says ciao 1,000 times a day, and hails everyone but his superior in that way. I think it is hardly the Italian pronoun, but rather a contraction of vecchio, old fellow. It is common with all classes of the people. Parents use it in speaking to their children, and brothers and sisters call one another ciao. It is a salutation between friends who cry out ciao as they pass in the street. Acquaintances, men who meet after separation, rush together with ciao. Then they kiss the right cheek, ciao on the left, ciao on the lips. Ciao, bon ciao. Footnote ends. The boys follow them, gambolling among the little iron crosses, and trying, if here and there, one of them may not be overthrown. We 2 strangers follow the boys. But here the pallbearers become puzzled. On the right is an open trench. On the left is an open trench. Presence of the devil, to which grave does this dead belong? They discuss, they dispute, they quarrel. From the side of the wall, as if he rose from the sea, appears the gravedigger, with his shovel on his shoulder, slouching towards us. Ah, hey, ciao the gravedigger, where does this dead belong? Body of Bacchus, what potatoes, here in this trench to the right. They set down the bier there gladly, they strip away the coffin's gay upper garment, they leave but the underdress of black box, painted to that favour with pitch. They shove it into the gravedigger's arms, where he stands in the trench, in the soft earth, rich with bones. He lets it slide swiftly to the ground. Thump. Ecco fatto. The two boys pick up the empty beer and dance merrily away with it to the Riva Gate, fanning a little play after the manner of children. Oh, what a beautiful dead! The eldest of the pleasant ruffians is all the pleasanter for Ciampagnan, and can hardly be persuaded to go out at the right gate. We strangers stay behind a little to consult with Mother Spectator. Venetian this. Who is the dead man, signore? It is a woman, poor little thing, dead in childbed. The baby is in there with her. It has been a cheerful funeral, and yet we are not in great spirits as we go back to the city. For my part, I do not think the cry of seagulls on a gloomy day is a joyous sound, and the sight of those theatrical angels with their shameless, unfinished backs flying off the top of the rococo facade of the Church of the Jesuits has always been a spectacle to fill me with despondency and foreboding. End of Chapter 19, recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 20 of Venetian Life by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Venetian traits and characters. On a small canal not far from the railroad station, the gondoliers show you a house by no means notable, except for the noble statue of a knight occupying a niche in one corner, as the house of Othello. It was once the palace of the patrician family of Moro, a name well known in the annals of the Republic, and one which, it has been suggested, misled Shakespeare into the invention of a Moor of Venice. Whether this is possibly the fact, or whether there is any tradition of a tragic incident in the history of the Moro family, similar to that upon which the play is founded, I do not know, but it is certain that the story of Othello, very nearly as Shakespeare tells it, is popularly known in Venice, and the gondoliers have fixed upon the Casa Moro in question as the edifice best calculated to give satisfaction to strangers in search of the true and memorable. The statue is happily darkened by time, and thus serves admirably to represent Othello's complexion, and to place beyond the shadow of a doubt the fact of his residence in the house. Indeed, what can you say to the gondolier who, in answer to your cavils, points to the knight with the convincing argument, "There is his statue"? One day I was taken to see this house in company with some friends, and when it had been victoriously pointed out as usual, we asked meekly, "Who was Othello?" "Othello, signori," answered the gondolier, "was a general of the Republic in the old times. He was an African and black, but nevertheless the state valued him, and he beat the Turks in many battles. Well, signori, this General Othello had a very young and beautiful wife, and his wife's cousin, Cassio, was his major domo, or as some say, his lieutenant. But after a while happens along another soldier of Othello, who wants Cassio's employment, and so accuses him to the general of corrupting his wife. Very well, signori. Without thinking an instant, Othello, being made so, flew into a passion, and killed his wife, and then, when her innocence came out, he killed himself and that liar, and the state confiscated his goods, he being a very rich man. There has been a tragedy written about all this, you know." "But how is it called? Who wrote it?" "Oh, in that regard, then, I do not know. Some Englishman." "Shakespeare?" "I don't know, signori, but if you doubt what I tell you, go to any bookseller and say, 'Favour me with the tragedy of Othello.' He will give it to you, and there you will find it all written out, just as I tell you." The gondolier confirmed the authenticity of his story by showing us the house of Cassio near the Rialto Bridge, and I have no doubt he would also have pointed out that of Iago if we had wished it. But as a general thing, the law of the gondoliers is not rich nor very great. They are a loquacious and a gossiping race, but they love better to have a quiet chat at the tops of their voices, as they loaf idly at the ferries, or to scream repartees across the Grand Canal, than to tell stories. In all history that relates to localities, they are sufficiently versed to find the notable places for strangers, but beyond this they trouble themselves as little with the past as with the future. 3 tragic legends, however, they know, and will tell with the most amusing effect, namely Biaso Luganega, the innocent baker boy, and Veneranda Porta. The first of these legends is that of a sausage maker who flourished in Venice some centuries ago and improved the quality of the broth, which the luganeghieri make of their scraps and sell to the gondoliers, by cutting up into it now and then a child of some neighbour. He was finally detected by a gondolier, who discovered a little finger in his broth, and being brought to justice, was dragged through the city at the heels of a wild horse. This most uncomfortable character appears to be the first hero in the romance of the gondoliers, and he certainly deserves to rank with that long line of imaginary personages who have made childhood so wretched and tractable. The second is the innocent baker boy already named, who was put to death on suspicion of having murdered a noble, because in the dead man's heart was found a dagger fitting a sheath which the baker had picked up in the street on the morning of the murder and kept in his possession. Many years afterwards, a malefactor who died in Padua confessed the murder, and thereupon 2 lamps were lighted before a shrine in the southern facade of St. Mark's Church, one for the murdered nobleman's soul, and the other for that of the innocent boy. Such is the gondolier's story, and the lamps still burn every night before the shrine from dark till dawn, in witness of its truth. The fact of the murder and its guiltless expiation is an incident of Venetian history, and it is said that the Council of Ten never pronounced a sentence of death thereafter, till they had been solemnly warned by one of their number with "Ricordativi del povero fornaretto," remember the poor baker boy. The poet D'Allungaro has woven the story into a beautiful and touching tragedy, but I believe the poet is still to be born who shall take from the gondoliers their Veneranda Porta and place her historic figure in dramatic literature. Veneranda Porta was a lady of the days of the Republic, between whom and her husband existed an incompatibility. This was increased by the course of Signora Porta in taking a lover, and it at last led to the assassination of the husband by the paramours. The head of the murdered man was found in one of the canals, and being exposed, as the old custom was, upon the granite pedestal at the corner of St. Mark's Church, it was recognised by his brother, who found among the papers on which his long hair was curled fragments of a letter he had written to the deceased. The crime was traced to the paramours, and being brought before the Ten, they were both condemned to be hanged between the columns of the Piazzetta. The gondoliers relate that when the sentence was pronounced, Veneranda said to the chief of the Ten, "But as for me, this sentence will never be carried out. You cannot hang a woman. Consider the impropriety." The Venetian rulers were wise men in their generation, and far from being balked by this question of delicacy, the chief replied, solving it, "My dear, you shall be hanged in my breeches." It is very coarse salt which keeps one of these stories. Another is remembered because it concerns one of the people, and another for its abomination and horror. The incidents of Venetian history which take the fancy and touch the sensibility of the world seem hardly known to the gondoliers, the most intelligent and quick-witted of the populace, and themselves the very stuff that some romantic dreams of Venice are made of. However sad the fact, it is undeniable that the stories of the sausage maker whose broth was flavoured with murder, and the baker boy who suffered guiltlessly, and that savage jest at the expense of the murderess, interest these people more than the high well-born sorrows of the Foscari, the tragic fate of Carmagnola, or the story of Thalia, which last I know partly, however, because of the scandal about Thalia's wife. Yet, after all, though the gondoliers are not the gondoliers of imaginative literature, they have qualities which recommend them to my liking, and I look back upon my acquaintance with 2 or 3 of them in a very friendly spirit. Compared with the truculent hackmen who prey upon the travelling public in all other cities of the civilised world, they are eminently intelligent and amiable. Rogues they are, of course, for small dishonesties are the breath in the nostrils of the common carriers by land or water everywhere, but the trickery of the gondoliers is so good-natured and simple that it can hardly offend. A very ordinary jocular sagacity defeats their profoundest purposes of swindling, and no one enjoys their exposure half so much as themselves, while the faint prospect of future employment purifies them of every trait of dishonesty. I had only one troublesome experience with them, and that was in the case of the old gondolier who taught me to row. He, when I had no longer need of his services, plunged into drunkenness, and came and dismissed me one day with every mark of ignominy, but he afterwards forgave me and saluted me kindly when we met. The immediate goal of every gondolier's ambition is to serve, no matter for how short a time, an Inglese, by which generic title nearly all foreigners except Germans are known to him. The Inglese, whether he be English or American, is apt to make the tour of the whole city in a gondola and give a handsome drink money at the end, whereas your Tedesco frugally walks to every place accessible by land, or when, in a party of 6 or 8, he takes a gondola, plants himself upon the letter of the tariff, and will give no more than the rate fixed by law. The gondolier is therefore flowingly polite to the Inglese, and he is even civil to the Tedesco. But he is not at all bound in courtesy to that provincial Italian who comes from the country to Venice, bargains furiously for his boat, and commonly pays under the tariff. The Venetian who does not himself keep a gondola seldom hires one, and even on this rare occasion makes no lavish demand, such as, "How much do you want for taking me to the railway station?" lest the fervid imagination of the gondolier rise to zwanzigers and florins, and a tedious dispute ensue. He asks, "How many sent to see me do you want?" and the contract is made for a number of soldi. The number of private gondolas owned in Venice is not very great. The custom is rather to hire a gondolier with his boat. The exclusive use of the gondola is thus secured, and the gondolier gives his services as a domestic when off his special duty. He waits at table, goes marketing, takes the children to school, and serves the ladies as footman for 5 francs a day, himself paying the proprietor of the gondola about 1 franc daily for the boat. In former times, when Venice was rich and prosperous, many noble families kept 6 or 7 gondolas, and what with this service and the numerous gala days of the Republic, when the whole city took boat for the Lido, or the Giudecca, or Murano, and the gondoliers were allowed to extract any pay they could, they were a numerous and prosperous class. But these times have passed from Venice for ever, and though the gondoliers are still, counting the boatmen of the Giudecca and the Lido, some thousands in number, there are comparatively few young men among them, and their gains are meagre. In the little city of Venice, where the dialect spoken at Cannaregio or Castello is a different tongue than that heard under the Procurati of St. Mark's Place, the boatmen of the several quarters of the city, of course, vary greatly in character and appearance, and the gondolier who lounges at the base of the columns of the Piazzetta, and airily invites the Inglese to tours of the Grand Canal, is of quite a different type from the weather-beaten barca Iolo who croaks barca at the promenaders on the Zattere. But all, as I say, are simple and harmless enough, and however loudly they quarrel among themselves, they never pass from the defamation of their female relatives to blows. As for the game of knives, as it is said to be played in Naples, and as About describes it at Rome, I doubt if it is much known to the populace of Venice. Only the doctors let blood there, though from their lancets it flows pretty freely and constantly. It is true that the gondolier loves best of everything a clamorous quarrel carried on with the canal between him and his antagonist. But next to this, he loves to spend his leisure at the ferry in talking of eating and of money, and he does not differ from many of his fellow citizens in choice of topics. I have seldom caught a casual expression from passers in the streets of Venice which did not relate in some way to gold Napoleons, zwanzigers, florins, or soldi, or else to wine and polenta. I note this trait in the Venetians, which Goldoni observed in the Milanese 100 years ago, and which I incline to believe is common to all Italians. The gondoliers talk a great deal in figure and hyperbole, and their jocose chaff is quite inscrutable, even to some classes of Venetians. With foreigners, to whom the silence and easy progress of the gondola gives them the opportunity to talk, they are fond of using a word or two of French. They are quick at repartee, and have a clever answer ready for most occasions. I was one day bargaining for a boat to the Lido, whither I refused to be taken in a shabby gondola or at a rate higher than 75 soldi for the trip. At last the patience of the gondoliers was exhausted, and one of them called out, "Somebody fetch the Bucentoro, and take this gentleman to the Lido for 75 soldi." The Bucentoro being the magnificent barge in which the Doge went toward the Adriatic. The skill with which the gondoliers manage their graceful craft is always admired by strangers, and is certainly remarkable. The gondola is very long and slender, and rises from the water at either end. Both bow and stern are sharp, the former being ornamented with that deeply serrated blade of steel which is the pride of the gondolier to keep bright as silver, and the poop having a small platform not far behind the cabin, on which he stands when he rows. The danger of collision has always obliged Venetian boatmen to face the bow, and the stroke with the oar, for the gondolier uses only a single oar, is made by pushing and not by pulling. No small degree of art, as I learned from experience, is thus required to keep the gondola's head straight, all the strokes being made on one side, and the sculling return of the oar blade, preparatory for each new stroke, is extremely difficult to effect. Under the hands of the gondolier, however, the gondola seems a living thing, full of grace and winning movement. The woodwork of the little cabin is elaborately carved, and it is usually furnished with mirrors and seats luxuriously cushioned. The sensation of the gondola's progress, felt by the occupant of the cabin as he falls back upon these cushions, may be described, to the female apprehension at least, as too divine. The cabin is removable at pleasure, and is generally taken off and replaced by awnings in summer, but in the evening, when the fair Venetians go out in their gondolas to take the air, even this awning is dispensed with, and the long slender boat glides darkly down the Grand Canal, bearing its dazzling freight of white tulle, pale-faced, black-eyed beauty, and flashing jewels, in full view. As for the singing of the gondoliers, they are the only class of Venetians who have not good voices, and I am scarcely inclined to regret the silence which long ago fell upon them. I am quite satisfied with the peculiar note of warning which they utter as they approach the corner of a canal, and which, meaning simply to the right or to the left, is the most pathetic and melancholy sound in the world. If, passing aside my own comfort, I have sometimes wished, for the sake of a dear sentimental old friend at home, who loves such idle illusions with an ardour unbecoming his years, that I might hear the voice of Adria's gondolier by distance mellowed o'er the water's sweep, I must confess that I never did hear it under similar circumstances except in conversation, across half a mile of lagoon, when, as usual, the burden of the lay was polenta or soldi. A recent Venetian writer, describing the character of the lower classes of Venice, says, "No one can deny that our populace is loquacious and quick-witted, but on the other hand no one can deny that it is regardless of improvement. Venice, a city exceptional in its construction, its customs, and its habits, has also an exceptional populace. It still feels, although 68 years have passed, the influence of the system of the fallen republic, of that oligarchic government, which, affording almost every day some amusement to the people, left them no time to think of their offended rights. Since 1859, Venice has resembled a sepulchre of the living, squalor and beggary gaining ground with each day, and commerce, with few exceptions, converted into monopoly. Yet the populace remains attached to its old habits, and will have its pleasure. If the earnings are little, what then? Must one die of ennui? The cafe is depopulated, not so the drinking house. The last day before the drawing of the lottery, the offices are thronged with fathers and mothers of families who stint their children of bread to buy dearly a few hours of golden illusion. At worst, there is the Monte di Pieta as a last resort." It is true, as this writer says, that the pleasure-loving populace still looks back fondly to the old republican times of feasting and holidays. But there is certainly no truth any more in the old idea that any part of Italy is a place where the people may be idle with impunity, or make amusement the serious business of life. I can remember that the book from which I received my first impressions of geography was illuminated with a picture professing to represent Italian customs. The spirit of inquiry had long before caused me to doubt the exact fidelity of this representation, but it cost me a pang to learn that the picture was utterly delusive. It has been no part of my experience in Venice to see an Italian sitting upon the ground and strumming the guitar, while two gaily dressed peasants dance to the music. Indeed, the indolence of Venetians is listless and silent, not playful or joyous, and as I learned to know their life more intimately, I came to understand that in many cases they are idle from despair of finding work, and that indolence is as much their fate as their fault. Any diligence of theirs is surprising to us of northern and free lands, because their climate subdues and enervates us, and because we can see before them no career open to intelligent industry. With the poorest, work is necessarily a hand-to-hand struggle against hunger. With those who would not absolutely starve without it, work is an inexplicable passion. Partly because the ways of these people are so childlike and simple in many things, and partly from one's own swindling tendency to take one's self in, a tendency really fatal to all sincerity of judgment and incalculably mischievous to such downfallen peoples as have felt the baleful effects of the world's sentimental impotent sympathy, there is something pathetic in the patient content with which the Italians work. They have naturally so large a capacity for enjoyment that the degree of self-denial involved in labour seems exorbitant, and one feels that these children, so loved of nature and so gifted by her, are harshly dealt with by their stepmother's circumstance. No doubt there ought to be truth in this silly old picture. If there is none, and I would willingly make believe to credit it if I could, I am glad that they at least work in old-world, awkward, picturesque ways, and not in commonplace, handy, modern fashion. Neither the habits nor the implements of labour are changed since the progress of the Republic ceased, and her heart began to die within her. All sorts of mechanics' tools are clumsy and inconvenient. The turner's lathe moves by broken impulses, door hinges are made to order, and lift the door from the ground as it opens upon them. All nails and tacks are handmade. Window sashes are contrived to be glazed without putty, and the panes are put in from the top, so that to repair a broken glass the whole sash is taken apart. Cooking stoves are unknown to the native cooks who work at an open fire with crane and dangling pothooks. Furniture is put together with wooden pegs instead of screws. You do not buy a door lock at a hardware store. You get a fabbro to make it, and he comes with a leathern satchel full of tools to fit and finish it on the door. The wheelbarrow of this civilization is peculiarly wonderful in construction, with a prodigious wooden wheel and a ponderous, incapable body. The canals are dredged with scoops mounted on long poles, and each manned by 3 or 4 chiasotti. There never was a pile-driving machine known in Venice, nor a steam tug in all the channels of the lagoons, through which the largest craft are towed to and from the ports by rowboats. In the model of the seagoing vessels there has apparently been little change from the first, yet, in spite of all this backwardness in invention, the city is full of beautiful workmanship in every branch of artificing, and the Venetians are still the best sailors in the Adriatic. I do not offer the idea as a contribution to statistics, but it seems to me that the most active branch of industry in Venice is plucking fowls. In summer the people all work on their thresholds and in their windows, and as nearly out of doors as the narrowness of the streets will let them, and it is hard to pass through any part of the city without coming to a poulterer's shop, in the door of which inevitably sits a boy tugging at the plumage of some wretched bird. He is seldom to be seen except in that crisis of plucking, when he seems to have all but finished, yet he seems never to accomplish the fact perfectly. Perhaps it is part of his hard fate that the feathers shall grow again under his hand as fast as he plucks them away. At the restaurants, I know, the quantity of plumage one devours in consuming roast chicken is surprising at first. The birds are always very lean too, and have but a languid and weary look, in spite of the ardent manner in which the boy clasps them while at work. It may be that the Venetians do not like fat poultry. Their turkeys especially are of that emaciation which is attributed among ourselves only to the turkey of Job, but as for the geese and ducks, they can only interest anatomists. It is as if the long ages of incursion and oppression, which have impoverished and devastated Italy, had at last taken effect upon the poultry and made it as poor as the population. I do not want to give too exclusive an impression of Venetian industry, however, for now I will remember the Venetian Lasagnoni, whom I never saw doing anything, and who certainly abound in respectable numbers. The Lasagnoni is a loafer, as an Italian can be a loafer, without the admixture of ruffianism which blemishes most loafers of the northern race. He may be quite worthless and even impertinent, but he cannot be a rowdy, that pleasing blossom on the nose of our fast, high-fed, thick-blooded civilization. In Venice he must not be confounded with other loiterers at the cafe, not with the natty people who talk politics interminably over little cups of black coffee, not with those old habituates who sit forever under the procurati, their hands folded upon the tops of their sticks and staring at the ladies, who pass with a curious steadfastness and knowing scepticism of gaze, not pleasing to the dim eyes of age. Certainly the last persons who bear any likeness to the Lasagnoni are the Germans, with their honest heavy faces comically anglicised by leg-of-mutton whiskers. The truth is, the Lasagnoni does not flourish in the best cafe. He comes to perfection in cheaper resorts, for he is commonly not rich. It often happens that a glass of water flavoured with a little anisette is the order of which he sits a whole evening. He knows the waiter intimately, and does not call him shop, Borghetta, as less familiar people do, but Gigi or Beppi, as the waiter is pretty sure to be named. "Behold," he says, when the servant places his modest drink before him, "who is that loveliest blonde there?" Or to his fellow Lasagnone, "She regards me. I have broken her the heart." This is his sole business and mission, the cruel Lasagnone, to break ladies the heart.
He spares no condition, neither rank nor wealth is any defence against him. I often wonder what is in that note he continually shows to his friend. The confession of some broken heart, I think. When he has folded it and put it away, he chuckles, "Ah, cara," and sucks his long, slender Virginia cigar. It is unlighted, for fire consumes cigars. I have never seen him read the papers, neither the Italian papers nor the Parisian journals, though if he can get Galignani, he is glad, and he likes to pretend to a knowledge of English, uttering upon occasion, with great relish, such distinctively English words as "yes" and "not," and to the waiter, "A little fire, if you please." He sits very late at the cafe and touches his hat, his curly French hat, to the company as he goes out with a mild swagger, his cane held lightly in his left hand, his coat cut snugly to show his hips, and genteelly swaying with the motion of his body. He is a dandy, of course, all Italians are dandies, but his vanity is perfectly harmless, and his heart is not bad. He would go half an hour out of his way to put you in the direction of the piazza. A little thing can make him happy: to stand in the pit of the opera and gaze at the ladies in the lower boxes, to attend the marionette or the Malibran Theatre and imperil the peace of pretty seamstresses and contaditas, to stand at the church doors and ogle the fair saints as they pass out. Go, harmless Lasagnoni, to thy lodging in some mysterious height, and break hearts if thou wilt. They are quickly mended. Of the other vagabonds in Venice, if I had my choice, I think I must select a certain ruffian who deals in dog flesh as the nearest my ideal of what a vagabond should be in all respects. He stands habitually under the old procurati, beside a basket of small puppies, in that snuffling and quivering state which appears to be the favourite condition of very young dogs, and occupies himself in conversation with an adjacent dealer in grapes and peaches, or sometimes fastidiously engages in trimming their hair upon the closely shaven bodies of the dogs, for in Venice it is the ambition of every dog to look as much like the Lion of St. Mark as the nature of the case will permit. My vagabond at times makes expeditions to the groups of travellers, always seated in summer before the Café Florian, appearing at such times with a very small puppy neatly poised upon the palm of his hand and winking pensively, which he advertises to the company as a beautiful beast or a lovely babe, according to the inspiration of his light and pleasant fancy. I think the latter term is generally used as a means of ingratiation with the ladies, to whom my vagabond always shows a demeanour of agreeable gallantry. I never saw him sell any of these dogs, nor ever in the least cast down by his failure to do so. His air is grave, but not severe. There is even at times a certain playfulness in his manner, possibly attributable to Champignon. His curling black locks, together with his velveteen jacket and pantaloons, are oiled and glossy, and his beard is cut in the French imperial mode. His personal preference is unwholesome, and it is chiefly his moral perfection as a vagabond that makes him fascinating. One is so confident, however, of his fitness for his position and business, and of his entire contentment with it, that it is impossible to not exult in him. He is not without self-respect. I doubt it would be hard to find any Venetian of any vocation, however base, who forgets that he, too, is a man and a brother. There is enough civility in the language. It is the fashion of the Italian tongue, with its tu for inferiors, voi for intimates and friendly equals, and lei for superiors. But in the manner there is none, and there is a sense of equality in the ordinary intercourse of the Venetians, at once apparent to foreigners. All ranks are orderly, the spirit of aggression seems not to exist among them, and the very boys and dogs in Venice are so well behaved that I have never seen the slightest disposition in them to quarrel. Of course, it is of the street boy, the biraccino, the boy in his natural, unreclaimed state, that I speak. This state is here, in winter, marked by a clouded countenance, bare head, tatters, and wooden-soled shoes open at the heels; in summer, by a preternatural purity of person, by abandon to the amphibious pleasure of leaping off the bridges into the canals, and by an insatiable appetite for polenta, fried minnows, and watermelons. When one of these boys takes to beggary, as a great many of them do, out of a spirit of adventure and wish to pass the time, he carries out the enterprise with splendid daring. A favourite artifice is to approach charity with a slice of polenta in one hand, and with the other extended, implore a soldi to buy cheese to eat with the polenta. The street boys also often perform the duties of granzieri, who draw your gondola to shore and keep it firm with a hook. To this order of beggar I usually gave, but one day at the railway station I had no soldi, and as I did not wish to render my friend discontented with future alms by giving silver, I deliberately apologised, praying him to excuse me, and promising him for another time. I cannot forget the lofty courtesy with which he returned, "So accommododi per, signor." They have sometimes a sense of humour, these poor swindlers, and can enjoy the exposure of their own enormities. An amiable rogue drew our gondola to land one evening. When we went too late to see the church of San Giorgio Maggiore, the sacristan made us free of a perfectly dark church, and we rewarded him as if it had been noonday. On our return to the gondola, the same beggar whom we had just feed held out his hat for another alms. "But we have just paid you," we cried, in an agony of grief and desperation. "Si, signore," he admitted with the air of argument. "È vero, ma la chiesa." "Yes, gentlemen, it is true, but the church," he added with confidential insinuation and a patronising wave of his hand toward the edifice, as if he had been San Giorgio himself, and held the church as a source of revenue. This was too much, and we laughed him to scorn, at which, beholding the amusing abomination of his conduct, he himself joined in our laugh with a cheerfulness that won our hearts. Beggary is attended by no disgrace in Italy, and it therefore comes that no mendicant is without a proper degree of self-respect common to all classes. Indeed, the habit of taking gifts of money is so general and shameless that the street beggars must be diffident souls indeed if they hesitated to ask for it. A perfectly well-dressed and well-mannered man will take 10 soldi from you for a trifling service, and not consider himself in the least abased. The detestable custom of largesse instead of wages still obtains in so great a degree in Venice, that a physician, when asked for his account, replies, "What you please to give." Knowing these customs, I hope I have never acted discourteously to the street beggars of Venice, even when I gave them nothing, and I know that only one of them ever so far forgot himself as to curse me for not giving. Him, however, I think to have been out of his right mind at the time. There were 2 mad beggars in the parish of San Stefano, whom I should be sorry to leave unmentioned here. One, who presided chiefly over the Campo San Stefano, professed to be also a facchino, but I never saw him employed except in addressing select circles of idlers, whom a brawling noise always draws together in Venice. He had been a soldier, and he sometimes put himself at the head of a file of Croats passing through the Campo, and gave them the word of command, to the great amusement of those swarthy barbarians. He was a good deal in drink, and when in this state was proud to go before any ladies who might be passing, and clear away the boys and idlers to make room for them. When not occupied in any of these ways, he commonly slept in the arcades of the old convent. But the mad beggar of Campo St. Angelo seemed to have a finer sense of what became him as a madman and a beggar, and never made himself obnoxious by his noise. He was, in fact, very fat and amiable, and in the summer lay asleep for the most part at a certain street corner which belonged to him. When awake, he was a man of extremely complacent presence, and suffered no lady to go by without a compliment to her complexion, her blonde hair, or her beautiful eyes, whichever it might be. He got money for these attentions, and people paid him for any sort of witticism. One day he said to the richest young dandy of the city, "Pa, you stomach me with your perfumes and fine airs," for which he received half a florin. His remarks to gentlemen had usually this sarcastic flavour. I am sorry to say that so excellent a madman was often drunk and unable to fulfil his duties to society. There are, of course, laws against mendicancy in Venice, and they are, of course, never enforced. Beggars abound everywhere, and nobody molests them. There was long a troop of weird sisters in Campo San Stefano, who picked up a livelihood from the foreigners passing to and from the Academy of Fine Arts. They addressed people with the title of Count, and no doubt gained something by this sort of heraldry, though there are counts in Venice almost as poor as themselves, and titles are not distinctions. The Venetian seldom gives to beggars. He says deliberately, "No go, I have nothing," or "Quando ritornerò," when I return, and never comes back that way. I noticed that professional hunger and cold took this sort of denial very patiently, as they did every other, but I confess I had never the heart to practise it.
In my walks to the public gardens, there was a venerable old man with the beard and bearing of a patriarch, whom I encountered on the last bridge of the Riva, and who there asked alms of me. When I gave him a soldo, he returned me a blessing which I would be ashamed to take in the United States for $50, and when the soldo was in some inaccessible pocket, and I begged him to await my coming back, he said sweetly, "Very well, senor, I will be here." And I must say to his credit, he never broke his promise, nor suffered me, for shame's sake, to break mine. He was quite a treasure to me in this respect, and assisted me to form habits of punctuality. That exuberance of manner which one notes the first thing in his intercourse with Venetians characterizes all classes, but is most excessive and relishing in the poor. There is a vast deal of ceremony with every order, and one hardly knows what to do with the numbers of compliments it is necessary to respond to. A Venetian does not come to see you, he comes to revere you. He not only asks if you be well when he meets you, but he bids you remain well at parting, and desires you to salute for him all common friends. He reverences you at leave-taking. He will sometimes consent to incommode you with a visit. He will relieve you of the disturbance when he rises to go. All spontaneous wishes which must, with us, take original forms, for lack of the complimentary phrase, are formally expressed by him. Good appetite to you when you go to dinner, much enjoyment when you go to the theatre, a pleasant walk if you meet in promenade. He is your servant at meeting and parting. He begs to be commanded when he has misunderstood you. But courtesy takes its highest flights, as I have hinted, from the poorest company. Acquaintances of this sort, when not on the ciao-chiapa footing, or that of the familiar thee and thou, always address each other in lei, lordship, or ello, as the Italians have it, and their compliment-making at encounter and separation is endless. I salute you, remain well, master, mistress, paron, parona, being repeated as long as the polite persons are within hearing. One day, as we passed through the crowded Maceria, an old Venetian friend of mine, who trod upon the dress of a young person before us, called out, "Scusate, bella Giovanni," pardon, beautiful girl. She was not so fair nor so young as I have seen women, but she half turned her face with a forgiving smile, and seemed pleased with the accident that had won her amiable apology. The waiter of the cafe, frequented by the people, says to the ladies for whom he places seats, "Take this place, beautiful blonde," or "Sit here, lovely brunette," as it happens. A Venetian who enters or leaves any place of public resort touches his hat to the company, and one day at the restaurant some ladies, who had been dining there, said "Complimenti" on going out, with a grace that went near to make the beefsteak tender. It is this uncostly gentleness of bearing which gives a winning impression of the whole people, whatever selfishness or real discourtesy lie beneath it. At home, it sometimes seems that we are in such haste to live and be done with it, we have no time to be polite. Or is popular politeness merely a vice of servile peoples? And is it altogether better to be rude? I wish it were not. If you are lost in his city, and you are pretty sure to be lost there continually, a Venetian will go with you wherever you wish, and he will do his amiable little service out of what one may say old civilization has established in place of goodness of heart, but which is perhaps not so different from it. You hear people in the streets bless each other in the most dramatic fashion. I once caught these parting words between an old man and a young girl. Giovannetta. "Reverend sir," patron revieto. Vecchio, with that peculiar backward wave and beneficent wag of the hand only possible to Italians. "Blessed child." Benedetta. It was in a crowd, but no one turned round at the utterance of terms which Anglo-Saxons would scarcely use in their most emotional moments. The old gentleman who sells boxes for the theatre, in the old procurati, always gave me his benediction when I took a box. There is equal exuberance of invective, and I have heard many fine maledictions on the Venetian streets, but I recollect none more elaborate than that of a gondolier who, after listening peacefully to a quarrel between two other boatmen, suddenly took part against one of them, and saluted him with, "Ah, baptized son of a dog! And if I had been present at thy baptism, I would have dashed thy brains out against the baptismal font." All the theatrical forms of passion were visible in a scene I witnessed in a little street near San Samuele, where I found the neighbourhood assembled at doors and windows in honour of a wordy battle between two poor women. One of these had been forced indoors by her prudent husband, and the other upbraided her across the marital barrier. The assailant was washing, and 20 times she left her tub to revile the besieged, who thrust her long arms out over those of her husband,
and turned each reproach back upon her who uttered it, thus: assailant, beast; besieged, thou; assailant, fool; besieged, thou; assailant, liar; besieged, thou. Et via insurgetto. At last the assailant, beating her breast with both hands and tempestuously swaying her person back and forth, wreaked her scorn in one wild outburst of vituperation, and returned finally to her tub, wisely saying, on the purple verge of asphyxiation, "Oh, non discorre più con gente." I returned half an hour later, and she was laughing and playing sweetly with her babe. It suits the passionate nature of the Italians to have incredible ado about buying and selling, and a day's shopping is a sort of campaign from which the shopper returns plundered and discomfited, or laden with the spoils of vanquished shopmen. The embattled commercial transaction is conducted in this wise. The shopper enters and prices a given article. The shopman names a sum of which only the fervid imagination of the South could conceive as corresponding to the value of the goods. The purchaser instantly starts back with a wail of horror and indignation, and the shopman throws himself forward over the counter with a protest that, far from being dear, the article is ruinously cheap at the price stated, though they may nevertheless agree for something less. What, then, is the most ultimate price? Properly, the most ultimate price is so much, say, the smallest trifle under the price first asked. The purchaser moves towards the door. He comes back and offers 1/3 of the very most ultimate price. The shopman, with a gentle desperation, declares that the thing cost him as much. He cannot really take the offer. He regrets, but he cannot, that the gentleman would say something more. So much, for example, that he regard the stuff, its quality, fashion, beauty. The gentleman laughs him to scorn. Ah, hey, and coming forward, he picks up the article and reviles it. Out of the mode, old, fragile, ugly of its kind. The shopman defends his wares. There is no such quantity and quality elsewhere in Venice, but if the gentleman will give even so much, still something preposterous, he may have it, though truly its sale for that money is utter ruin. The shopper walks straight to the door. The shopman calls him back from the threshold, or sends his boy to call him back from the street. Let him accommodate himself, which is to say, take the thing at his own price. He takes it. The shopman says cheerfully, "Servo suo." The purchaser responds, "Bon dì, patron." Good day, my master. Thus, I said, every bargain is a battle, and every purchase a triumph or a defeat. The whole thing is understood, and the opposing forces know perfectly well all that is to be done beforehand, and retire after the contest like the captured knights in Morgante Maggiore, calm as oil, however furious and deadly their struggle may have appeared to strangers. Foreigners soon discern, however, that there is no bloodshed in such encounters, and enter into them with a zeal as great as that of natives, though with less skill. I knew one American who prided himself on such matters, and who haughtily closed a certain bargain without words, as he called it. The shopman offered him several articles, for which he demanded prices amounting in all to 93 francs. His wary customer rapidly computed a total, and replied, "Without words now, I'll give you 100 francs for that lot." With a pensive elevation of the eyebrows and a reluctant shrug of the shoulders, the shopman suffered him to take them. Your Venetian is simpatico if he is anything. He is always ready to feel and to express the deepest concern, and I rather think he likes to have his sensibilities appealed to as a pleasant and healthful exercise for them. His sympathy begins at home, and he generously pities himself as the victim of a combination of misfortunes which leave him citizen of a country without liberty, without commerce, without money, without hope. He next pities his fellow citizens, who are as desperately situated as himself. Then he pities the degradation, corruption, and despair into which the city has fallen, and I think his compassion is the most hopeless thing in his character. That alone is touched, that alone is moved, and when its impulse ceases, he and everything about him remain just as before. With the poor, this sensibility is amusingly mischievous. They never speak of one of their own class without adding some ejaculation as "poor fellow" or "poor little creature." They pity all wretchedness, no matter from what cause, and the greatest rogue has their compassion when under a cloud. It is all but impossible to punish thieves in Venice, where they are very bold and numerous, for the police are too much occupied with political surveillance to give due attention to mere cut-purses and housebreakers, and even when they make an arrest, people can hardly be got to witness against their unhappy prisoner. Poveretta anche lui. There is no work and no money, people must do something, so they steal. Ci vuol pazienza. Bear witness against an ill-fated fellow-sufferer? God forbid. Stop a thief?
I think a burglar might run from Rialto to San Marco, and not one compassionate soul in the Merceria would do aught to arrest him. Poveretto. Thieves came to the house of a friend of mine at noonday when his servant was out. They tied their boat to his landing, entered his house, filled their boat with plunder from it, and rowed out into the canal. The neighbours on the floor above saw them, and cried, "Thieves! Thieves!" It was the most frequented part of the Grand Canal, where scores of boats passed and repassed, but no one molested the thieves, and these poveretti escaped with their booty. Footnote: the rogues, it must be confessed, are often very polite. This same friend of mine one day found a man in the act of getting down into a boat with his favourite singing bird in its cage. "What are you doing with that bird?" he thought himself authorised to inquire. The thief looked about him a moment, and perceiving himself detected, handed back the cage with a cool "La scusi," beg pardon, as if its removal had been a trifling inadvertence. One night, in a little street through which we passed to our ferry, there came a wild rush before us of a woman screaming for help, and pursued by her husband with a knife in his hand. Their children, shrieking piteously, came after them. The street was crowded with people and soldiers, but no one put out his hand, and the man presently overtook his wife and stabbed her in the back. We only knew of the rush, but what it all meant we could not tell till we saw the woman bleeding from the stab, which happily was slight. Inquiry of the bystanders developed the facts, but singularly enough, scarcely a word of pity. It was entirely a family affair, it seemed. The man, poor fellow, had a mistress, and his wife had maddened him with reproaches. Comme ça fait. He had to stab her. The woman's case was not one that appealed to the popular compassion, and the only words of pity for her which I heard were expressed by the wife of a fruiterer, whom her husband angrily silenced. End of chapter 20. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 21 of Venetian Life by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Society. It was natural that the Venetians, whose state lay upon the borders of the Greek Empire, and whose greatest commerce was with the Orient, should be influenced by the Constantinopolitan civilization. Mutinelli records that in the 12th century they had many religious offices and observances in common with the Greeks, especially the homily or sermon, which formed a very prominent part of the service of worship. At this time also, when the rupture of the Lombard League had left other Italian cities to fall back into incessant local wars and barbarized their customs, the people of Venice dressed richly and delicately, after the Greek fashion. They combed and dressed their hair and wore the long, pointed Greek beard. Footnote: A. Foscari, in 1687, was the last patrician who wore the beard. Footnote ends. And though these Byzantine modes fell for the most part into disuse in after time, there is still a peculiarity of dress among the women of the Venetian poor, which is said to have been inherited from the oriental costumes of Constantinople, namely that high-heeled, sharp-toed slipper or sandal, which covers the front of the foot and drops from the heel at every step, requiring no slight art in the wearer to keep it on at all. The philosophic vision, accustomed to relate trifling particulars to important generalities, may perhaps see another relic of Byzantine civilization among the Venetians in that jealous restraint which they put upon all the social movements of young girls, and the great liberty which they allow to married women. It is true that their damsels are now no longer imprisoned under the parental roof, as they were in times when they never left its shelter but to go closely veiled to communion in the church on Christmas and Easter, but it is still quite impossible that any young lady should go out alone. Indeed, she would scarcely be secure from insult in broad day if she did so. She goes out with her governess, and even with this protection she cannot be too guarded and circumspect in her bearing, for in Venice a woman has to encounter upon the public street a rude license of glance from men of all ages and conditions, which falls little short of outrage. They stare at her as she approaches, and I have seen them turn and contemplate ladies as they passed them, keeping a few paces in advance, with a leisurely sidelong gait. Something of this insolence might be forgiven to thoughtless, hot-blooded youth, but the gross and knowing leer that the elders of the piazza and cafe put upon the approach of a pretty girl is an ordeal which few women, not as thoroughly inured to it as the Venetians, would care to encounter. However, as I never heard the trial complained of by any but foreigners, I suppose it is not regarded by Italians as intolerable, and it is certain that an audible compliment upon the street to a pretty girl of the poor is by no means an affront. The arts of pleasing and coquetry come by nature to the gentler sex, and if in Italy they add to them a habit of intrigue, I wonder how much they are to blame, never being in any wise trusted. They do not differ from persons of any age or sex in that country, if the world has been as justly, as it has always been firmly, persuaded that the people of Italy are effete in point of good faith. I have seen much to justify this opinion, and something also to confute it, and as long as Garibaldi lives, I shall not let myself believe that a race which could produce a man so signally truthful and single-hearted is a race of liars and cheats. I think the student of their character should also be slow to upbraid Italians for their duplicity without admitting, in palliation of the fault, facts of long ages of alien and domestic oppression in politics and religion, which must account for a vast deal of every kind of evil in Italy. Yet, even after exception and palliation has been duly made, it must be confessed that in Italy it does not seem to be thought shameful to tell lies, and that there the standard of sincerity, compared with that of the English or American, is low, as the Italian standard of morality in other respects is also comparatively low. With the women bred in idleness and ignorance, the imputed national untruthfulness takes the form naturally to be expected, and contributes to a state of things which must be examined with the greatest caution and reservation by everyone but the Italians themselves. Goethe says that there is no society so corrupt that a man may not live virtuously in it, and I think the immorality of any people will not be directly and wholly seen by the stranger who does not seek it. Certainly the experience and acquaintance of a foreigner in Italy must have been most unfortunate if they confirm all the stories of corruption told by Italians themselves. A little generous distrust is best in matters of this kind, but while I strengthen my incredulity concerning the utter deprivation of Venetian society in one respect, I am not disposed to deal so leniently with it in others. The state of things is bad in Venice, not because all women in society are impure, but because the Italian theory of morals does not admit the existence of opportunity without sin. It is by rare chance that a young girl makes acquaintance with young men in society. She seldom talks with them at parties, to which she is sometimes taken by her mother, and they do not call upon her at her home, while for her to walk alone with a young man would be vastly more scandalous than much worse things, and is consequently unheard of. The Italians say freely they cannot trust their women as northern women are trusted, and some Italian women frankly confess that their sex would be worse if it were trusted more, but the truth does not appear in this shallow suspicion and this shallow self-conviction, and one who cares to have a just estimate of this matter must by no means believe all the evil he hears. There may be much corruption in society, but there is infinitely more wrong in the habits of idle gossip and guilty scandal, which eat all sense of shame and pity out of the heart of Venice. There is no parallel to the prying, tattling, backstabbing littleness of the place elsewhere in the world. A small country village in America or England has its meddlesomeness, but not its worldly wicked sharpness. Figure the meanness of chimney-corner gossip, added to the bitter shrewdness and witty penetration of a gifted roue, and you have some idea of Venetian scandal. In that city, where all the nobler organs of expression are closed by political conditions, the viler channels run continual filth and poison, and the people shut out from public and free discussion of religious and political themes, occupy themselves with private slander, and rend each other in their abject desperation. As it is part of the existing political demonstration to avoid the opera and theatre, the Venetians are deprived of these harmless distractions. Balls and evening parties, at which people in other countries do nothing worse than bore each other, are almost unknown for the same reason, and when persons meet in society, it is too often to retail personalities or Italian politics made as unintelligible and as like local gossip as possible. The talk which is small and noxious in private circles is the same thing at the cafe, when the dread of spies does not reduce the talkers to a dreary silence. Not permitted to feel the currents of literature and the world's great thought in religion freshly and directly, they seldom speak of these things except in that tone of obsolete superiority which Italians are still prone to affect, as the monopolists of culture. As to art, the Venetians are insensible to it and ignorant of it, here in the very atmosphere of art to a degree absolutely amusing. I would as soon think of asking a fisher's opinion of water as of asking a Venetian's notion of architecture or painting, unless he were himself a professed artist or critic. Admitting, however, that a great part of the corruption of society is imputed,
there still remains, no doubt, a great deal of real immorality to be accounted for. This, I think, is often to be attributed to the bad system of female education and the habits of idleness in which women are bred. Indeed, to Americans, the whole system of Italian education seems calculated to reduce women to a state of imbecile captivity before marriage, and I have no fault to find with the Italians that they are jealous in guarding those whom they have unfitted to protect themselves, but have rather to blame them that after marriage their women are thrown at once upon society, when worse than helpless against its temptations. Except with those people who attempt to maintain a certain appearance in public upon insufficient means, and there are too many of these in Venice as everywhere else, and who spare in every other way that they may spend on dress, it does not often happen that Venetian ladies are housekeepers. Servants are cheap and numerous, as they are uncleanly and untrustworthy, and the Venetians prefer to keep them. Footnote: a clerk or employee with a salary of 50 cents a day keeps a maidservant that his wife may fulfil to society the important duty of doing nothing. Footnote ends. Rather than take part in housewifely duties, and since they must lavish upon dress and show, to suffer from cold and hunger in their fathers' houses and at their meagre boards. In this way, the young girls kept imprisoned from the world, instead of learning cookery and other domestic arts, have the grievous burden of idleness added to that of their solitary confinement, not only among the rich and noble, but among the large class which is neither, and wishes to appear both. Footnote: the poet Gray, genteelly making the grand tour in 1740, wrote to his father from Florence, "The only thing the Italians shine in is their reception of strangers. At such times everything is magnificence, the more remarkable as in their ordinary course of life they are parsimonious to a degree of nastiness. I saw in one of the vastest palaces of Rome, that of Prince Pamphilo, the apartment which he himself inhabited, a bed that most servants in England would disdain to lie in, and furniture much like that of a soph at Cambridge. This man is worth £30,000 a year." End quote. Italian nature has changed so little in a century that all this would hold admirably true of Italian life at this time. The goodly outside, in religion, in morals, in everything, is too much the ambition of Italy. This achieved, she is content to endure any pang of self-denial, and sell what little comfort she knows. It is mostly imported, like the word, from England, to strangers at fabulous prices. In Italy the luxuries of life are cheap, and the conveniences unknown or excessively dear. Footnote ends. Their idle thoughts, not drilled by study nor occupied with work, run upon the freedom which marriage shall bring them, and form a distorted image of the world, of which they know as little as they know their own undisciplined selves. Denied the just and wholesome amusements of society during their girlhood, it is scarcely a matter of surprise that they should throw themselves into the giddiest whirl of excitement when marriage sets them free to do so. I have said I do not think Venetians who give each other bad names are always to be credited, and I have no doubt that many a reputation in Venice is stained while the victim remains without guilt. A questioned reputation is, however, no great social calamity. It forms no bar to society, and few people are so cruel as to blame it, though all discuss it, and it is here that the harshness of American and English society toward the erring woman, harshness which is not injustice, but half justice only, contrasts visibly to our advantage over the bad naivety and lenity of the Italians. The carefully secluded Italian girl is accustomed to hear of things and speak of things which, with us, parents strive in every way to keep from their daughters' knowledge, and while her sense of delicacy is thus early blunted, while she is thus used to know good and evil, she hears her father and mother comment on the sinful errors of a friend or neighbour who visits them and meets them every day in society. How can the impunity of guilt, which she believes to exist around her, but sometimes have its effect, and ripen with opportunity into wrong? Nay, if the girl reveres her parents at all, how can she think the sin which they caress in the sinner is so very bad? If, however, she escape all these early influences of deprivation, if her idleness and solitude and precocious knowledge leave her unvitiated, if she goes into society, it is by marriage with a man who is neither a dotard nor a fortune-seeker, and who remains constant and does not tempt her by neglect to forebode offence and to inflict anticipative reprisals. Yet her purity goes uncredited, as her guilt would go unpunished. Scandal makes haste to blacken her name to the prevailing hue, and whether she has sin or not, those with sin will cast not the stone that breaks and kills, but the filth that sticks and stinks. The wife must continue the long social exile of her girlhood if she would not be prey to scandal.
The Cavaliere Servente no longer exists, but gossip now attributes often more than one lover in his place, and society has the cruel clemency to wink at the licence. Nothing is in worse taste than jealousy, and consequently, though intrigue sometimes causes stabbing and the like among low people, it is rarely noticed by persons of good breeding. It seems to me that in Venetian society the reform must begin not with dissolute life, but with the social toleration of the impure, and with the wanton habits of scandal, which make all other life incredible, and deny to virtue the triumph of fair fame. I confess that what I saw of the innocent amusements of this society was not enough to convince me of their brilliancy and attractiveness, but I doubt if a foreigner can be a trustworthy judge of these things, and perhaps a sketch drawn by an alien hand in the best faith might have the air of caricature. I would not, therefore, like to trust my own impression of social diversions. They were very probably much more lively and brilliant than I thought them, but Italians assembled anywhere, except at the theatre or the café, have a certain stiffness, all the more surprising because tradition has always led one to expect exactly the reverse of them. I have seen nothing equal to the formality of this people, who deride colder nations for inflexible manners, and I have certainly never seen society in any small town in America so ill at ease as I have seen society in Venice writhing under self-imposed restraints. At a musical soirée attended by the class of people who, at home, would have been chatty and sociable, given to making acquaintance and to keeping up acquaintance, the young men harmlessly talking and walking with the young ladies, and the old people listening together, while constant movement and intercourse kept life in the assembly, there was some real pleasure felt amidst a good deal of unavoidable suffering. I say, I found such a soirée in Venice to be a spectacle of ladies planted in formal rows of low necks and white dresses around the four sides of one room, and the gentlemen restively imprisoned in dress coats and white gloves in another. During the music, all these devoted people listened attentively, and at the end the ladies lapsed back into their chairs and fanned themselves, while the gentlemen walked up and down the floor of their cell, and stopped 2 by 2 at the door of the ladies' room, glanced mournfully athwart the moral barrier which divided them, and sadly and dejectedly turned away. Amazed at this singular species of social enjoyment, I inquired afterward of a Venetian lady if evening parties in Venice were usually such ordeals, and was discouraged to learn that what I had seen was scarcely an exaggeration of prevailing torments. Commonly people do not know each other, and it is difficult for the younger to procure introductions, and when there is previous acquaintance, the presence of some commanding spirit is necessary to break the ice of propriety, and substitute enjoyment for correctness of behaviour. Even at dancing parties, where it would seem the poetry of motion might do something to soften the rigid bosom of Venetian deportment, the poor young people separate after each dance, and take each sex its appointed prison, till the next quadrille offers them a temporary liberation. For my own part, I cannot wonder that young men fly these virtuous scenes and throng the rooms of those pleasant women of the demi-monde, who only exact from them that they shall be natural and agreeable. I cannot wonder that their fair partners in wretchedness seize the first opportunity to revenge themselves upon the propriety which has so cruelly used them. It is said that the assemblies of the Jews, while quite as unexceptionable in character, are far more sociable and lively than those of the Christians. The young Hebrews are frequently intelligent, well-bred, and witty, with a savoir-faire which their Christian brethren lack. But indeed the young Venetian is, at that age, when all men are owlish, ignorant, and vapid, the most owlish, ignorant, and vapid man in the world. He talks not milk and water, but warm water alone, a little sweetened, and until he has grown wicked, he has very little good in him. Most ladies of fashion receive calls on a certain day of each week, when it is made a matter of pride to receive as many calls as possible. The number sometimes reaches 300 when nobody sits down, and few exchange more than a word with the hostess. In winter the stove is heated on these reception days, and little cups of black coffee are passed round to the company. In summer lemonade is substituted for the coffee, but in all seasons a thin waferish slice of toasted rusk, the Venetian baccolo, is offered to each guest with the drink. At receptions where the sparsity of the company permits the lady of the house to be seen, she is commonly visible on a sofa, surrounded by visitors in a half-circle. Nobody stays more than 10 or 15 minutes, and I have sometimes found even this brief time of much greater apparent length, and apt to produce a low state of nerves, from which one seldom recovers before dinner. Gentlemen, however, do not much frequent these receptions, and I assert again the diffidence I should feel in offering this glance at Venetian social enjoyment as conveying a just and full idea of it. There is no doubt that the Venetians find delight in their assemblies, where a stranger seeks in vain. I dare say they would not think our own reunions brilliant, and that looking obliquely, as a foreigner must, on the most sensible faces at one of our evening parties, they might mistake the look of pathetic dejection visible in them as the expression of people rather bored by their pleasure than otherwise. The conversazioni are of all sorts, from the conversazioni of the rigid proprietarians, where people sit down to a kind of hopeless whist at a soldo the point and say nothing, to the conversazioni of the demi-monde, where they say anything. There are persons in Venice, as well as everywhere else, of new-fashioned modes of thinking, and these strive to give a greater life and ease to their assemblies by attracting as many young men as possible, and in their families gentlemen are welcome to visit, and to talk with the young ladies in the presence of their mothers. But though such people are no more accused of impropriety than the straightest of the old-fashioned, they are not regarded with the greatest esteem, and their daughters do not so readily find husbands. The Italians are fickle, the women say. They get soon tired of their wives after marriage, and when they see much of ladies before marriage, they get tired of them then, and never make them their wives. So it is much better to see nothing of a possible husband till you actually have him. I do not think conversazioni of any kind are popular with young men, however. They like better to go to the cafe, and the people you meet at private houses are none the less interesting for being old or middle-aged. A great many of the best families at present receive no company at all, and see their friends only in the most private manner, though there are still cultivated circles to which proper introduction gives the stranger, who has no Austrian acquaintance, access. But unless he have thorough knowledge of Italian politics, localized to apply to Venice, an interest in the affairs, fortunes, and misfortunes of his neighbours, and an acquaintance with the Venetian dialect, I doubt he will be able to enjoy himself in the places so cautiously opened to him. Even in the most cultivated society, the dialect is habitually spoken, and if Italian is used, it is only in compliment to some foreigner present, for whose sake also topics of general interest are sometimes chosen. The best society is now composed of the families of professional men, such as the advocates, the physicians, and the richer sort of merchants. The shopkeepers, master artisans, and others, whom industry and thrift distinguish from the populace, seem not to have any social life in the American sense. They are wholly devoted to affairs, and partly from choice and partly from necessity, are sordid and grasping. It is their class which has had to fight hardest for life in Europe, and they give no quarter to those above or below them. The shop is their sole thought and interest, and they never sink it. But since they have the habits of diligence, and as far as they are permitted of enterprise, they seem to be in great part the stuff from which a prosperous state is to be rebuilt in Venice, if ever the fallen edifice rise again. They have sometimes a certain independence of character, which a better condition of things and further education would perhaps lift into honesty, though as yet they seem not to scruple to take any unfair advantage, and not to know that commercial success can never rest permanently on a system of bad faith. Below this class is the populace, between which and the patrician order a relation something like the Roman clientage existed, contributing greatly to the maintenance of exclusively aristocratic power in the state. The greatest conspiracy, that of Maronphalia, which the Commons ever moved against the oligarchy, was revealed to one of the nobility by his plebeian creature or client, and the government rewarded by every species of indulgence a class in which it had extinguished even the desire of popular liberty. The airs of the servile baseness which such a system as this must create are not yet extinct. There is still a helplessness in many of the servant class, and a disposition to look for largesse as well as wages, which are the traits naturally resulting from a state of voluntary submission to others. The nobles, as the government, enervated and debauched the character of the poor by public shows and countless holidays. As individuals, they taught them to depend upon patrician favour, and not upon their own plebeian industry, for support. The lesson was an evil one, hard to be unlearned, and it is yet to be forgotten in Venice. Certain traits of soft and familiar dependence give great charm to the populace, but their existence makes the student doubtful of a future to which the plebeians themselves look forward with perfect hope and confidence. It may be that they are right, and will really rise to the dignity of men when free government shall have taught them that the labourer is worthy of his hire, after he has earned it. This has been the result to some degree in the kingdom of Italy, where the people have found that freedom, like happiness, means work. Undoubtedly the best people in the best society of Venice are the advocates, an order of consequence even in the times of the Republic, though then shut out from participation in public affairs by a native government, as now by a foreign one. Acquaintance with several members of this profession impressed me with a sense of its liberality of thought and feeling, where all liberal thinking and feeling must be done by stealth, and where the common intelligence of the world sheds its light through multiplied barriers. Daniel Manin, the President of the Republic of 1848, was of this class, which, by virtue of its learning, enlightenment, and talent, occupies a place in the esteem and regard of the Venetian people far above that held by the effete aristocracy. The better part of the nobility, indeed, is merged in the professional class, and some of the most historic names are now preceded by the learned titles of doctor and advocate, rather than the cheap dignity of count, offered by the Austrian government to all the patricians who chose to ask for it when Austrian rule was extended over their country. The physicians rank next to the advocates, and are usually men learned in their profession, however erroneous and old-fashioned some of their theories of practice may be. Like the advocates, they are often men of letters. They write for the journals and publish little pamphlets on those topics of local history which it is so much the fashion to treat in Venice. No one makes a profession of authorship. The returns of an author's work would be too uncertain, and its restrictions and penalties would be too vexatious and serious, and so literary topics are only occasionally treated by those whose main energies are bent in another direction. The doctors are very numerous, and a considerable number of them are Hebrews, who, even in the old jealous times, exercised the noble art of medicine, and who now rank very highly among their professional brethren. These physicians haunt the neat and tasteful apothecary shops, where they sit upon the benching that passes round the interior, read the newspapers, and discuss the politics of Europe, Asia, Africa, and America, with all the zest that you may observe to characterize their discussions in Goldoni's plays. There they spend their evenings and many hours of every day, and thither the sick send to call for them, each physician resorting to a particular apothecary's and keeping his name inscribed on a brass plate against the wall above the head of the druggist, who presides over the reunions of the doctors, while his apprentice pestles away at their prescriptions. In 1786 there were, what with priests, monks, and nuns, a multitude of persons of ecclesiastical profession in Venice, and though many convents and monasteries were abolished by Napoleon, the priests are still very numerous, and some monastic establishments have been revived under Austrian rule. The high officers of the church are, of course, well paid, but most of the priesthood live miserably enough. They receive from the government a daily stipend of about 35 soldi, and they celebrate Mass, when they can get something to do in that way, for 40 soldi. Unless, then, they have a private income from their own family, or have paid for the education of some rich man's son or daughter, they must fare slenderly. There is much said in and out of Venice about their influence in society, but this is greatly modified, and I think chiefly exercised upon the women of the old-fashioned families. Footnote: it is no longer usual for girls to be educated in convents, and most young ladies of the better classes, up to the age of 13 or 14 years, receive their schooling in secular establishments, whither they go every day for study, or where they sometimes live, as in our boarding schools, and where they are taught the usual accomplishments, greater attention being paid to French and music than other things. Footnote ends. I need hardly repeat the well-known fact that all the moral power of the Roman Church over the younger men is gone. These seldom attend Mass and almost never go to confession, and the priests are their scorn and byword. Their example in some degree must be much followed also by the young women, and though women must everywhere make more public professions of religion than men in order to retain social standing, I doubt if the priests have a very firm hold upon the fears or reverence of the sisters and wives of liberal Venetians. If, however, they contribute in any wise to keep down the people, they are themselves enslaved to their superiors and to each other. No priest can leave the city of Venice without permission of the Patriarch. He is cut off as much as possible from his own kinspeople and subjected to the constant surveillance of his class. Obliged to maintain a respectable appearance on 20 cents a day, hampered and hindered from all personal liberty and private friendship, and hated by the great mass of the people, I hardly think the Venetian priest is to be envied in his life. For my own part, knowing these things, I was not able to cherish towards the priests those feelings of scornful severity which swell many Protestant bosoms, and so far as I made their acquaintance, I found them kind and amiable. One ecclesiastic, at least, I may describe as one of the most agreeable and cultivated gentlemen I ever met. Those who fare best among the priests are the Jesuits, who returned from repeated banishment with the Austrians in this century. Their influence is very extended, and the confessional is their forte. Venetians say that with the old and the old-fashioned, these crafty priests suggest remorse and impose penances, that with the young men and the latter-day thinkers, they are men of the world, and pass off pleasant sins as trifles. All the students of the government schools are obliged by law to confess twice a month, and are given printed certificates of confession in blank, which the confessor fills up and stamps with the seal of the church. Many of them go to confess at the church of the Jesuits, who are glad to hear the cock and bull story invented by the student, and to cultivate his friendship by an easy penance and a liberal tone. This ingenious young man, of course, despises the confessional. He goes to confess because the law obliges him to do so, but the law cannot dictate what he must confess. Therefore, he ventures as near downright burlesque as he dares, and if the account he gives of the matter be true, puts off his confessor with some well-known fact, as that he has blasphemed. Of course he has blasphemed, blasphemy being as common as the forms of salutation in Venice. So the priest, who wishes him to come again, and to found some sort of influence over him, says, "Oh dear, dear, this is very bad. Blasphemy is a deadly sin. If you must swear, swear by the heathen gods. Say, body of Diana instead of body of God, presence of the devil instead of blood of Mary. Then there is no harm done." The students laugh over the pleasant absurdity together, and usually agree upon the matter of their semi-monthly confessions beforehand. As I have hinted, the young men do not love the government of the Church, and though I account for the loss of much high hope and generous sympathy in growth from youth to middle age, I cannot see how, when they have replaced their fathers, the present religious and political discontent is to be modified. Nay, I believe it must become worse. The middle-aged men of Venice grew up in times of comparative quiet, when she did not so much care who ruled over her, but negatively at least they honoured the Church. They may now hate the foreign rule, but there are many considerations of timidity and many effects of education to temper their hate. They may dislike the priests, but they revere the Church. The young men of today are bred in a different school, and all their thoughts are of opposition to the government and of war upon the Church, which they detest and ridicule. The fact that their education is still in the hands of the priests in some measure does not render them more tractable. They have no fears to be wrought upon by their clerical professors, whom seldom have sought to act upon their nobler qualities. The influence of the priesthood is again limited by the fact that the teachers in the free schools of the city, to which the poor send their children, are generally not priests, and ecclesiastics are no longer so commonly the private tutors of the children of the rich, as they once were when they lived with the family and exercised a direct and important influence on it. Express permission from the Pope is now necessary to the maintenance of a family chaplain, and the office is nearly disused. Footnote: in early days, every noble Venetian family had its chaplain, who, on the occasion of great dinners and suppers, remained in the kitchen and received as one of his perquisites the fragments that came back from the table. Footnote ends. The Republic was extremely jealous of the political power of the priests, who could not hold secular office in its time. A curious punishment was inflicted upon the priest who proved false to his own vows of chastity, and there is a most amusing old ballad, by no means cleanly in its language, purporting to be the lament of a priest suspended in the iron cage appointed for the purpose, from the belfry of the Campanile San Marco, and enduring the jeers and insults of the mob below. We may suppose that with advancing corruption, if corruption has indeed advanced from remote to later times, this punishment was disused for want of room to hang out the delinquents. In the last century, especially, the nuns and monks led a pleasant life. You may see in the old pictures of Pietro Longhi and his school how, at the aristocratic and fashionable convent of San Zaccaria, the lady nuns received their friends and acquaintances of this world in the anteroom, where the dames and their cavaliers flirted and drank coffee, and the gentlemen coquetted with the brides of heaven through their grated windows. Among other privileges of the Church abolished in Venice long ago was the ancient right of the monks of St. Anthony, abbot, by which their herds of swine were made free of the whole city. These animals, enveloped in an odour of sanctity, wandered here and there, and were piously fed by devout people, until the year 1409, when, being found dangerous to children and inconvenient to everybody, they were made the subject of a special decree which deprived them of their freedom of movement. The Republic was always limiting the privileges of the Church. It is known how, when the Holy Inquisition was established in its dominions in 1249, the state stipulated that great part of the process against heresy should be conducted by secular functionaries, and that the sentence should rest with the Doge and his councillors. A kind of inquisition with claws clipped and teeth filed, as one may say, and the only sort ever permitted in Venice. At present there is no absolute disfavour shown to the clergy, but, as we have seen, many a pleasant island, which the monks of old reclaimed from the salty marshes and planted with gardens and vineyards, now bears only ruins of their convents, or else, converted into a fortress or government depot, is all thistly with bayonets. Anciently, moreover, there were many little groves in different parts of the city where the pleasant clergy of what Mr. Ruskin would have us believe the pure and religious days of Venice met and made merry so riotously together by night that the higher officers of the church were forced to prohibit their little soirees. An old custom of rejoicing over the installation of a new parish priest is still to be seen in almost primitive quaintness. The people of each parish, nobles, citizens, and plebeians alike, formally elected their own priest, and till the year 1576 they used to perambulate the city to the sound of drums with banners flying after an election, and proclaim the name of their favourite. On the day of the Parrocho's induction, his portrait was placed over the church door, and after the celebration of the morning mass, a breakfast was given, which grew to be so splendid in time that in the 15th century a statuette limited its profusion. In the afternoon, the new Parrocho, preceded by a band of military music, visited all the streets and courts of his parish, and then, as now, all the windows of the parish were decorated with brilliant tapestries and other gay-coloured cloths and pictures. In those times, as in these, there was an illumination at night, throngs of people in the campo of the church, and booths for traffic in cakes of flour and raisins, fried in lard upon the spot, and sold smoking hot, with immense uproar on the part of the merchant, and for 3 days afterward the parish bells were sounded in concert. The difficulty of ascertaining anything with certainty in Venice attends, in a degree peculiarly great, the effort to learn exactly the present influence and standing of the nobility as a class. One is tempted, on observing the free and unembarrassed bearing of all ranks of people towards each other, to say that no sense of difference exists, and I do not think there is ever shown among Italians either the aggressive pride or the abject meanness which marks the intercourse of people and nobles elsewhere in Europe, and I have not seen the distinction of rich and poor made so brutally in Italy as sometimes as in our own so distant democratic society at home. There is, indeed, that equality in Italian fibre which I believe fits the nation for democratic institutions better than any other, and which is perhaps partly the result of their ancient civilization. At any rate, it fascinates a stranger to see people so mutually gentle and deferential, and must often be a matter of surprise to the Anglo-Saxon, in whose race, reclaimed from barbarism more recently, the native wild beast is still so strong as to sometimes inform the manner. The uneducated Anglo-Saxon is a savage. The Italian, though born to utter ignorance, poverty, and depravity, is a civilized man. I do not say that his civilization is of a high order, or that the civilization of the most cultivated Italian is at all comparable to that of a gentleman among ourselves. The Italian's education, however profound, has left his passions undisciplined, while it has carefully polished his manner. He yields lightly to temptation, he loses his self-control, he blasphemes habitually. His gentleness is conventional, his civilization not individual. With us, the education of a gentleman, I do not mean a person born to wealth or station, but any man who has trained himself in morals or religion, in letters, and in the world, disciplines the impulses and leaves the good manner to grow naturally out of habits of self-command and consequent habitual self-respect. The natural equality of the Italians is visible in their community of good looks as well as good manners. They have never, perhaps, that high beauty of sensitive expression which is found among Englishmen and Americans, preferably among the latter. But it very rarely happens that they are brutally ugly, and the man of low rank and mean vocation has often a beauty of as fine sort as the man of education and refinement. If they changed clothes and the poor man could be persuaded to wash himself, they might successfully masquerade one for another. The plebeian Italian, inspired by the national vanity, bears himself as proudly as the noble, without all aggressing in his manner. His beauty, like that of the women of his class, is world-old, the beauty of the pictures and the statues. The ideal types of loveliness are realized in Italy. The saints and heroes, the Madonnas and nymphs, come true to the stranger at every encounter with living faces. In Venice particularly, the carriage of the women of whatever rank is very free and noble, and the servant is sometimes to be distinguished from the mistress only by her dress and by her labour-coarsened hands. Certainly not always by her dirty fingernails and foul teeth, for though the clean shirt is now generally in Italy, some lesser virtues are still unknown. The nail-brush and toothbrush are of but infrequent use, the four-pronged fork is still imperfectly understood, and as a nation the Italians may be said to eat with their knives. The Venetian, then, seeing so little difference between himself and others, whatever his rank may be, has, as I said, little temptation to arrogance or servility. The effects of the old relationship of patron and client are amusingly noticeable in the superior as well as the inferior. A rich man's dependents are perfectly free with advice and comment, and it sometimes happens that he likes to hear their lively talk, and at home secretly consorts with his servants. The former social differences between commoners and patricians, which I think, judging from the natural temper of the race, must have been greatly modified at all times by concession and exception, may be said to have quite disappeared in point of fact. The nobility is now almost as effete socially as it is politically. There is still a number of historic families which are in a certain degree exclusive, but rich parvenus have admission to their friendship, and commoners in good circumstances are permitted their acquaintance. The ladies of this patrician society visit ladies of less rank and receive them at their great parties, though not at more sacred assemblies, where they see only each other. The Venetians have a habit of saying their best families are in exile, but this is not meant to be taken literally. Many of the best families are yet in the city, living in perfect retirement, or very often merged in the middle class and become men of professions and active, useful lives. Of these nobles, they usually belong to the families which did not care to ask nobility of Austria, and are therefore untitled. Footnote: the only title conferred on any patrician of Venice during the Republic was Cavaliere, and this was conferred by a legislative act in reward of distinguished service. The names of the nobility were written in the Golden Book of the Republic, and they were addressed as Illustrissimo or Excellenza. They also signed themselves Nobile between the Christian name and surname, as is still the habit of the untitled nobility to do. Footnote ends. The citizens are affectionately proud, while I have heard from them nothing but contempt and ridicule of the patricians who, upon a wretched pension or meagre government office, attempt to maintain patrician distinction. Such nobles are usually Austriacanti in their politics and behind the age in everything, while there are other descendants of patrician families mingled at last with the very populace, sharing their ignorance and degradation and feeling with them. These sometimes exercise the most menial employments. I knew one noble lord who had been a facchino, and I heard of another who was a street sweeper. Contice non conta niente. Footnote: a count who doesn't count money counts for nothing. Footnote ends. Says the sneering Italian proverb, and it would be little less than miraculous if a nobility like that of modern Venice maintained superior state and regard in the eyes of the quick-witted, intelligent, sarcastic community. The few opulent patricians are by no means the most violent of the Italianissimi. They own lands and houses, and as property is unsafe when revolutionary feeling is rife, their patriotism is tempered. The wealth amassed in early times by the vast and enterprising commerce of the country was, when not dissipated in riotous splendour, invested in real estate upon the mainland as the Republic grew in territory, and the income of the nobles is now from the rents of these lands. They reside upon their estates during the season of the villeggiatura, which includes the months of September and October, when everyone who can possibly leave the city goes into the country. Then the patricians betake themselves to their villas near Padua, Vicenza, Bassano, and Treviso, and people the sad-coloured, weather-worn stucco hermitages, where the mutilated statues swaggering above the gates forlornly commemorate days when it was a far finer thing to be a noble than it is now. I say the villas look dreary and lonesome, as places can be made to look in Italy, what with their high garden walls, their long, low piles of stabling, and the passé indecency of their nymphs and fauns, foolishly strutting in the attitudes of the silly and sinful old past. And it must be but a dull life that the noble proprietors lead there. It is better, no doubt, on the banks of the Brenta, where there are still so many villas as to form a street of these seats of luxury almost the whole length of the canal, from Fusina to Padua. I am not certain that they have a right to the place which they hold in literature and sentiment, and yet there is something very charming about them, with their gardens and chapels and statues and shaded walks. We went to see them one day early in October, and found them every one, when habitable, inhabited, and wearing a cheerful look that made their proximity to Venice incredible. As we returned home after dark, we saw the ladies from the villas walking unattended along the road and giving the scene an air of homelike peace and trustfulness, which I had not found before in Italy, while the windows of the houses were brilliantly lighted, as if people lived in them, whereas you seldom see a light in Venetian palaces. I am not sure that I did not like better, however, the villas that were empty and ruinous, and the gardens that had run wild, and the statues that had lost legs and arms. Some of the ingenious proprietors had enterprisingly whitewashed their statues, and there was a horrible primness about certain of the well-kept gardens which offended me. Most of the houses were not large, but there was here and there a palace as grand as any in the city. Such was the great villa of the Contarini of the Lions, which was in every way superb, with 2 great lions of stone guarding its portals, and a gravel walk overarched with stately trees, stretching a quarter-mile before it. At the moment I was walking down this aisle, I met a clean-shaven old canonicho with red legs and red-tasseled hat, and with a book under his arm and a meditative look, whom I here thank for being so venerably picturesque. The palace itself was shut up, and I wish I had known when I saw it that it had a ghostly underground passage from its cellar to the chapel, wherein, when you get halfway, your light goes out and you consequently never reach the chapel. This is at Mira, but the greatest of all the villas is the magnificent country seat of the family Pisani at Stra, which now, with scarcely any addition to its splendour, serves for the residence of the abdicated Emperor of Austria. There is such pride in the vastness of this edifice and its gardens as impresses you with the material greatness which found expression in it, and never raises a regret that it has utterly passed away. You wander around through the aisles of trim-cut lime trees, bullied and overborne by the insolent statues, and expect at every turn to come upon intriguing spectres in bagwigs, immense hoops, and patches. How can you feel sympathy for those dull and wicked ghosts of 18th century corruption? There is rottenness enough in the world without digging up old putridity and sentimentalizing on it. And I doubt if you will care to know much of the way in which the noble owner of such a villa ascended the Brenta at the season of the villeggiatura, in his great gilded barge, all carven outside, with the dumpling loaves and loose nymphs of the period, with fruits and flowers and what not, and within, luxuriously cushioned and furnished and stocked with good things for pleasure-making in the gross old fashion. King Cole was not a merrier old soul than Illustrissimo of that day. He outspent princes, and his agent, while he harried the tenants to supply his master's demands, plundered Illustrissimo frightfully. Illustrissimo never looked at accounts. He said to his steward, "Caravecchio fevu, mi remetto a quel che fevu." "Old fellow, you attend to it. I shall be satisfied with what you do." So the poor agent had no other course but to swindle him, which he did, and Illustrissimo, when he died poor, and left his lordly debts and vices to his sons. In Venice the noble still lives sometimes in his ancestral palace, dimly occupying the halls where his forefathers flourished in so much splendour. I can conceive, indeed, of no state of things more flattering to human pride than that which surrounded the patrician of the old aristocratic republic. The house in which he dwelt was the palace of a king, in luxury of appointment and magnificence of size. Troops of servants that ministered to his state peopled its vast extent, and the gondolas that carried his grandeur abroad were moored in little fleets to the piles that rose before his palace, painted with the family arms and colours. The palace itself stood usually on the Grand Canal, and rose sheer from the water, giving the noble that haughty inaccessibility which the lord of the mainland achieved only by building lofty walls and multiplying gates. The architecture was as costly in its ornament as wild Gothic fancy or Renaissance luxury of bad taste could make it, and when the palace front was not of sculptured marble, the painter's pencil filled it with the delight of colour. The mainland noble's house was half a fortress, and formed his stronghold in times of popular tumult or family fray. But at Venice the strong arm of St. Mark's oppressed all turbulence in a city secure from foreign war, and the peaceful arts rejoiced in undisturbed possession of the palaces, which rose in the most delicate and fantastic beauty, and mirrored in the brine a dream of sea-deep strangeness and richness. You see much of the beauty yet, but the pride and opulence which called it into being are gone forever. Most palaces, whether of the Gothic or Classicistic period, have the same internal arrangement of halls and chambers, and are commonly built of 2 lofty and 2 low stories. On the ground floor or water level is a hall running back from the gate to a bit of garden at the other side of the palace, and on either side of this hall, which in old times was hung with the family trophies of the chase and war, are the porter's lodge and gondolier's rooms. On the first and second stories are the family apartments, opening on either side from great halls, of the same extent as that below, but with loftier roofs, of heavy rafters, gilded or painted. The 4th floor is of the same arrangement, but has a lower roof, and was devoted to the better class of servants. Of the 2 stories used by the family, the 3rd is the loftier and airier, and was occupied in summer. The 2nd was the winter apartment. On either hand, the rooms opened in suites. We have seen something of the ceremonies, public and private, which gave peculiar gaiety and brilliance to the life of the Venetians of former days, but in his political character the noble had yet greater consequence. He was part of the proudest, strongest, and securest system of his time. He was a king with the fellowship of kings, flattered with the equality of an aristocracy, which was master of itself and of its nominal head. During the earlier times it was his office to go daily to Rialto and instruct the people in their political rights and duties for 4 hours. And even when the duties became everything and the rights nothing, after the Serre di Consiglio, the friendly habit of daily intercourse between patricians and citizens was still kept up at the same place. Once each week, and on every holiday, the noble took his seat in the Grand Council, the most august assembly in the world without doubt, or the 10, or the 3, according to his office in the state, holding his place in the council by right of birth, and in the other bodies by election of his peers. Although the patricians were kept as one family apart from the people, and jealously guarded in their aristocratic purity by the state, they were only equals of the poorest before the laws of their own creation, and their condescension to the people was frequent and great. Indeed, the Venetians of all classes are social creatures, loving talk and gossip, and these constant habits of intercourse must have done much to produce the equality of manner now observable in them. Their amusements were for a long time the same, the nobles taking part in the public holidays and in the popular exercises of rowing and swimming. In earlier times, hunting in the lagoons was a favourite diversion, but as the decay of the Republic advanced and the patricians blossomed into the fine gentlemen of the last century, these hearty sports were relinquished, and everything was voted vulgar, but masking in carnival, dancing and gaming at ridotto, and intriguing everywhere. The accounts which Venetian writers give of Republican society in the 18th century form a chronique scandaleuse, which need not be minutely copied here. Much may be learned of Venetian manners of this time from the comedies of Goldoni, and the faithlessness of society may be argued from the fact that in these plays, which contain nothing salacious or indecent, there is scarcely a character of any rank who scruples to tell lies, and the truth is not to be found in works intended to school the public in virtue. The ingenious old playwright's memoirs are full of gossip concerning that poor old Venice, which is now no more, and the worthy autobiographer, Casanova, also gives much information about things that had best not be known. As the Republic drew near its fall in 1797, there was little left in its dominant class worth saving, if we may believe the testimony of Venetians, which Mutinelli brings to bear upon the point in his Annali Urbani and his History of the last 50 years of the Republic. Long prosperity and prodigious opulence had done their worst, and the patricians and the lowest orders of the people, their creatures and dependents, were thoroughly corrupt, while the men of professions began to assume that station which they now hold. The days of a fashionable patrician of those times began a little before sunset, and ended with the following dawn. Rising from his bed, he dressed himself in dainty linen, and placed himself in the hands of the hairdresser to be combed, oiled, perfumed, and powdered, and then sallied forth for a stroll through the Merceria, where this excellent husband and father made tasteful purchases to be carried to the lady he served. At dinner, which he took about 7 or 8, his board was covered with the most tempting viands, and surrounded by needy parasites who detailed the spicy scandals of the day in payment of their dinner. while the children of the host were confided to the care of the corrupt and negligent servants. After dinner, the father went to the theatre or the casino, and spent the night over cards and wine in the society of dissolute women, and renewed on the morrow the routine of his useful existence. The education of the children of the man of fashion was confided to a priest who lived in his family, and called himself an abate, after the mode of the abbés of French society. He had winning manners with the ladies, indulgent habits with his pupils, and dressed his elegant person in silks of Lyons and English broadcloths. In the pleasant old days he flitted from palace to villa, dining and supping, and flattering the ladies, and tapping the lid of his jewelled snuff-box in all fashionable companies. He was the cadet of a patrician family, when not the ambitious son of a low family, with a polite taste for idleness and intrigue, for whom no secular sinecure could be found in the state, and who obliged the church by accepting orders. Whether in the palace on the Grand Canal or the villa on the Brenta, this gentle and engaging priest was surely the most agreeable person to be met, and the most dangerous to ladies' hearts, with his rich suit of black, and his smug, clean-shaven face, and his jewelled hands, and his sweet, seducing manners. Alas, the world is changed. The priests whom you see playing tresette now at the Conversazione are altogether different men, and the delightful abate is as much out of fashion as the bagwig or the queue. When in fashion, he loved the theatre, and often showed himself there at the side of his noble patron's wife. Nay, in that time the theatre was so prized by the church that a popular preacher thought it becoming to declare from his pulpit that to compose well his hearers should study the comedies of Goldoni, and his hearers were the posterity of that devout old aristocracy which never undertook a journey without first receiving the Holy Sacrament, which had built the churches and endowed them for private wealth. Ignorance, as well as vice, was the mode in those days, and it is related that a charming lady of good society once addressed a foreign savant at her conversazione, and begged him to favour the company with a little music, because, having heard that he was virtuous, she had no other association with the word than its technical use in Italy to indicate a professional singer as a virtuoso. A father of a family, who kept no abate for the education of his children, ingeniously taught them himself. "Father," asked one of the children, "what are the stars?" "The stars are stars, and little things that shine as thou seest." "Then they are candles, perhaps?" "Make thy account that they are candles exactly." "Of wax or tallow?" pursues the boy. "What, tallow candles in heaven?" "No, certainly wax, wax." These and many other scandalous stories the Venetian writers recount of the last days of their republic, and the picture they produce is one of the most shameless ignorance, the most polite corruption, the most unblushing baseness. I have no doubt that the picture is full of national exaggeration. Indeed, the method of Mutinelli, who I believe intends to tell the truth, in writing social history is altogether too credulous and incautious. It is well enough to study contemporary comedy for light upon past society, but satirical ballads and lampoons and scurrilous letters cannot be accepted as historical authority. Still, there is no question but Venice was very corrupt. As you read of her people in the last century, one by one, the ideas of family, faith, and domestic purity fade away. One by one, the beliefs in public virtue are dissipated, until at last you are glad to fly the study, close the filthy pages, and take refuge in doubt of the writers, who declare that they must needs disgrace Venice with facts, since her children have dishonoured her in their lives. Such as we see them, they say, were the patricians, such the people of Venice after the middle of the 18th century. The Venetians might be considered as extinguished. The marvellous city, the pomp only of the Venetians, existed. Shall we believe this? Let each choose for himself. At that very time, the taste and wealth of a Venetian noble fostered the genius of Canova, and then, when their captains starved the ragged soldiers of the Republic to feed their own idleness and vice, when the soldiers dismantled her forts to sell the guns to the Turk, when her sailors rioted on the shore, and her ships rotted in her ports, she still had military virtue enough to produce that Emo, who beat back the Algerine corsairs from the commerce of Christendom, and attacked them in their stronghold, as of old her galleys beat back the Turks. Alas, there was not the virtue in her statesmen to respond to this greatness in the hero. One of their last public acts was to break his heart with insult, and to crave peace of the pirates whom he had cowed. It remained for the helpless Doge, and the abject patricians, terrified at a threat of war, to declare the Republic at an end, and San Marco was no more. I love republics too well to lament the fall of Venice, and yet pax tibi marce. If I have been slow to praise, I shall not hasten to condemn a whole nation. Indeed, so much occurs to me to qualify with contrary sense what I have written concerning Venice, that I wonder if, after all, I have not been treating throughout less of the rule than the exception. It is a doubt which must force itself upon every fair and temperate man who attempts to describe another people's life and character, and I confess that it troubles me so sorely now at the end of my work that I would fain pray the gentle reader to believe much more good and much less evil of the Venetians than I have said. I am glad that it remains for me to express a faith and hope in them for the future, founded upon their present political feeling, which, however tainted with self-interest, in the case of many, is no doubt with the great majority a high and true feeling of patriotism, and it is impossible to believe that a people who can maintain the stern and unyielding attitude now maintained by the Venetians toward an alien government, disposed to make them any concession short of freedom in order to win them into voluntary submission, can be wanting in the great qualities which distinguish living peoples from those passed hopelessly into history and sentiment. In truth, glancing back over the whole career of the nation, I can discern in it nothing so admirable, so dignified, so steadfastly brave as its present sacrifice of all that makes life easy and joyous to the attainment of a good which shall make life noble. The Venetians desire now, and first of all things, liberty, knowing that in slavery men can learn no virtues, and I think them fit, with all their errors and defects, to be free now, because men are never fit to be slaves. End of chapter 21, recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Chapter 22 of Venetian Life by William Dean Howells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. Our last year in Venice, as it seems 7 years after. The last of 4 years which it was our fortune to live in the city of Venice was passed under the roof of one of her most beautiful and memorable palaces, namely the Palazzo Giustiniani, whither we went, as has been told in an earlier chapter of this book, to escape the encroaching nepotism of Giovanna, the flower of serving women. The experience now in Cambridge, Massachusetts, refuses to consort with ordinary remembrances, and has such a fantastic preference for the company of rather vivid and circumstantial dreams, that it is with no very strong hope of making it seem real that I shall venture to speak of it. The Giustiniani were a family of patricians very famous during the times of a republic that gave so many splendid names to history, and the race was preserved to the honour and service of St. Mark by one of the most romantic facts of his annals. During a war with the Greek emperor in the 12th century, every known Giustiniani was slain, and the heroic strain seemed lost for ever. But the state that mourned them bethought itself of a half-forgotten monk of their house, who was wasting his life in the convent of San Nicolo. He was drawn forth from this seclusion, and the permission of Rome being won, he was married to the daughter of the reigning doge. From them descended the Giustiniani of after times, who still exist. Indeed, in the year 1865, there came one day a gentleman of the family and tried to buy from our landlord that part of the palace which we so humbly and insufficiently inhabited. It is said that as the unfrocked friar and his wife declined in life, they separated, and, as if in doubt of what had been done for the state through them, each retired to a convent. Giustiniani going back to San Nicolo, and dying at last to the murmur of the Adriatic waves along the Lido's sands. Next after this Giustiniani, I like best to think of that latest hero of the family, who had the sad fortune to live when the ancient republic fell, at a threat of Napoleon, and who alone among her nobles had the courage to meet with a manly spirit the insolent menaces of the conqueror. The Giustiniani governed Treviso for the Senate. He refused, when Napoleon ordered him from his presence to quit Treviso without the command of the Senate,
He flung back the taunts of bad faith cast upon the Venetians, and when Napoleon changed his tone from that of disdain to one of compliment, and promised that in the general disaster he was preparing for Venice, Giustiniani should be spared, the latter generously replied that he had been a friend of the French only because the Senate was so. As to the immunity offered, all was lost to him in the loss of his country, and he should blush for his wealth if it remained intact amidst the ruin of his countrymen. The family grew in riches and renown from age to age, and some 4 centuries after the marriage of the monk, they reared 3 beautiful Gothic palaces in the noblest site on the Grand Canal, whence, on one hand, you can look down to the Rialto Bridge, and on the other, far up toward the Church of the Salute and the Basin of St. Mark. The architects were those Buoni, father and son, who did some of the most beautiful work on the ducal palace, and who wrought in equal inspiration upon these homes of the Giustiniani, building the delicate Gothic arches of the windows with their slender columns and their graceful balconies, and crowning all with the airy battlements. The largest of the 3 palaces became, later, the property of the Foscari family, and here dwelt with his father that unhappy Jacopo Foscari, who, after thrice suffering torture by the state for a murder he never did, at last died in exile. Hither came the old Doge Foscari, who had consented to this cruel error of the state, and who, after a life spent in its service, was deposed and disgraced before his death, and whither, when he lay dead, came remorseful Venice, and claimed for sumptuous obsequies the dust which his widow yielded with bitter reproaches. Here the family faded away generation by generation, till, according to the tale told us early in this century, when the ultimate male survivor of the line had died, under a false name in London, where he had been some sort of obscure actor, there were but 2 old maiden sisters left, who, lapsing into imbecility, were shown to strangers by the rascal servants as the last of the Foscari. And here, in our time, was quartered a regiment of Austrian troops, whose neatly pipe-clayed belts decorated the balconies on which the princely ladies of the house had rested their jewelled arms in other days. The Foscari added a story to the palace to distinguish it from the other 2 palaces Giustiniani, but these remain to the present day as they were originally planned. That in which we lived was called Palazzo Giustiniani of the Bishops, because one of the family was the first patriarch of Venice. After his death he was made a saint by the Pope, and it is related that he was not only a very pious but a very good man. In his last hours he admitted his beloved people to his chamber, where he meekly lay upon a pallet of straw, and at the moment he expired 2 monks in the solitude of their cloister heard an angelical harmony in the air. The clergy performed his obsequies not in black, funereal robes, but in white garments, and crowned with laurel, and bearing gilded torches, and although the patriarch had died of a malignant fever, his body was miraculously preserved incorrupt during the 65 days that the obsequies lasted. The other branch of the family is called Giustiniani of the Jewels, from the splendour of their dress, but neither palace now shelters any of their magnificent race. The edifice on our right was exclusively occupied by a noble Viennese lady who, as we heard vaguely in the right Venetian fashion, had been a ballet dancer in her youth, and who now, in her matronly days, dwelt apart from her husband, the Russian Count, and had gondoliers in blue silk and the finest gondola on the Grand Canal, but was a plump, florid lady, looking long past beauty, even as we saw her from our balcony. Our own palace, as we absurdly grew to call it, was owned and inhabited in a manner much more proper to modern Venice, the proprietorship being about equally divided between our own landlord and a very well-known Venetian painter, son of a painter still more famous. This artist was a very courteous old gentleman who went with Italian and clock-like regularity every evening in summer to a certain café, where he seemed to make it a point of conscience to sip one sherbet and to read the Journal des Débats. In his coming and going, we met him so often that we became friends, and he asked us many times to visit him and see his father's pictures and some famous frescoes with which his part of the palace was adorned. It was a characteristic trait of our life that, though we constantly meant to avail ourselves of this kindness, we never did so, but we continued in the enjoyment of the beautiful garden, which this gentleman owned at the rear of the palace, and on which our chamber windows looked. It was full of oleanders and roses and other bright and odorous blooms, which we could enjoy perfectly well without knowing their names. And I could hardly say whether the garden was more charming when it was in its summer glory, or when, on some rare winter day, a breath from the mountains had clothed its tender boughs and sprays with the light and effervescent flowering of snow.
At any season the lofty palace walls rose over it and shut it in a pensive seclusion, which was loved by the old mother of the painter and by his elderly maiden sister. These often walked on its moss-grown paths, silent as the roses and oleanders to which one could have fancied the blossom of their youth had flown. And sometimes there came to them there grave, black-gowned priests, for the painters was a devout family, and talked with them in tones almost as tranquil as the silence was, save when one of the ecclesiastics placidly took snuff. It is a dogma of the church for priests to take snuff in Italy, and thereafter, upon a prolonged search for his handkerchief, blew a resounding nose. So far as we knew, the garden wall circumscribed the whole life of these ladies, and I am afraid that such topics of this world as they touched upon with their priests must have been deplorably small. Their kinsman owned part of the story under us, and both of the stories above us. He had the advantage of the garden over our landlord, but he had not so grand a gondola gate as we, and in some other respects I incline to think that our part of the edifice was the finer. It is certain that no mention is made of any such beautiful hall in the property of the painter, as is noted in that of our landlord by the historian of 100 Palaces of Venice, a work for which I subscribed, and then, for my merit, was honoured by a visit from the author, who read aloud to me in a deep and sonorous voice the annals of our temporary home. This hall occupied half the space of the whole floor, but it was altogether surrounded by rooms of various shapes and sizes, except upon one side of its length, where it gave through Gothic windows of vari-coloured glass upon a small court below. A green mouldy little court, further dampened by a cistern, which had the usual curb of a single carven block of marble. The roof of this stately sala was traversed by a long series of painted rafters, which in the halls of nearly all Venetian palaces are left exposed, and painted or carved and gilded. A suite of stately rooms closed the hall from the Grand Canal, and one of these formed our parlour. On the side opposite the Gothic windows was a vast aristocratic kitchen, which, with its rows of shining coppers, its great chimney-place well advanced toward the middle of the floor, and its tall, gloomy windows, still affects my imagination as one of the most patrician rooms which I ever saw. At the back of the hall were those chambers of ours overlooking the garden, of which I have already spoken, and another kitchen, less noble than the first, but still sufficiently grandiose to make most New World kitchens seem very meekly minute and unimpressive. Between the two kitchens was another court with another cistern, from which the painter's family drew water with a bucket on a long rope, which, when let down from the fourth story, appeared to be dropped from the clouds, and descended with a noise little less alarming than thunder. Altogether the most surprising object in the great sala was a sewing machine, and we should have been inconsolably outraged by its presence there amid so much that was merely venerable and beautiful, but for the fact that it was in a state of harmonious and hopeless disrepair, and, from its general contrivance, gave us the idea that it had never been of any use. It was, in fact, kept as a sort of curiosity by the landlord, who exhibited it to the admiration of his Venetian friends. The reader will doubtless have imagined, from what I have been saying, that the Palazzo Giustiniani had not all the machinery which we know in our houses here as modern improvements. It had nothing of the kind, and life there was, as in most houses in Italy, a kind of permanent camping out. When I remember the small amount of carpeting, of furniture, and of upholstery we enjoyed, it appears to me pathetic, and yet I am not so sure that it was not the wisest way to live. I know that we had compensation in things not purchasable here for money. If the furniture of the principal bedroom was somewhat scanty, its dimensions were unstinted. The ceiling was 15 feet high, and was divided into rich and heavy panels, adorned each with a mighty rosette of carved and gilded wood 2 feet across. The parlour had not only its original decorations in our time, but it had once had so noble a carved ceiling that it was found worth while to take it down and sell it into England, and it still had 2 grand Venetian mirrors, a vast and very good painting of a miracle of St. Anthony, and imitation antique tables and armchairs. The last were frolicked all over with carven nymphs and cupids, but they were of such frail construction that they were not meant to be sat in, much less to be removed from the wall against which they stood, and more than one of our American visitors was dismayed at having these proud articles of furniture go to pieces upon his attempt to use them like mere armchairs of ordinary life. Scarcely less impressive or useless than these was a monumental plaster stove, surmounted by a bust of Aesculapius. When this was broken by accident, we cheaply repaired the loss with a bust of Homer, the dealer in the next campo being out of Aesculapiuses, which no one could have told from the bust it replaced, and this and other artistic glories of the room made us quite forget all possible blemishes and defects. And will the reader mention any house with modern improvements in America, which has also windows with pointed arches of marble, opening upon balconies that overhang the Grand Canal? For our new apartment, which consisted of 6 rooms, furnished with every article necessary for Venetian housekeeping, we paid $1 a day, which in the innocence of our hearts we thought rather dear, though we were somewhat consoled by reflecting that this extravagant outlay secured us the finest position on the Grand Canal. We did not mean to keep house, as we had, at Cacefalia, and perhaps a sketch of our easier menage may not be out of place. Breakfast was prepared in the house, for in that blessed climate all you care for in the morning is a cup of coffee with a little bread and butter, a muskmelon, and some clusters of white grapes, more or less. Then we had our dinner sent in warm from a cook's, who had learned his noble art in France. He furnished a dinner of 5 courses for 3 persons at a cost of about 80 cents, and they were dinners so happily conceived and so justly executed that I cannot accuse myself of an excess of sentiment when I confess that I sigh for them to this day. Then, as for our immaterial tea, we always took that at the Café Florian, in the Piazza of St. Mark, where we drank a cup of black coffee and ate an ice, while all the world promenaded by, and the Austrian bands made heavenly music. Those bands no longer play in Venice, and I believe that they are not the only charm which she has lost in exchanging Austrian servitude for Italian freedom, though I should be sorry to think that freedom was not worth all the other charms. The poor Venetians used to be very rigorous, as I have elsewhere related, about the music of their oppressors, and would not come into the piazza until it had ceased, and the Austrian promenaders had disappeared, when they sat down at Florian's and listened to such bands of strolling singers and minstrels as chose to give them a concord of sweet sounds without foreign admixture. We in our neutrality were wont to sit out both entertainments, and then go home well toward midnight, through the sleepy little streets and over the bridges that spanned the narrow canals, dreaming in the shadows of the palaces. We moved with half-conscious steps till we came to the silver expanse of the Grand Canal, where, at the ferry, darkled a little brood of black gondolas, into one of which we got, and were rowed noiselessly to the thither side, where we took our way toward the land gate of our palace through the narrow streets of the parish of San Barnaba and the Campo before the ugly facade of the church, or else we were rowed directly to the water gate, where we got out on the steps worn by the feet of the Giustiniani of old, and wandered upward through the darkness of the stairway, which gave them a far different welcome of servants and lights when they returned from an evening's pleasure in the piazza. It seemed scarcely just, but then those Giustiniani were dead, and we were alive, and that was one advantage, and, besides the loneliness and desolation of the palace, had a peculiar charm, and were at any rate cheaper than its former splendour could have been. I am afraid that people who live abroad in the palaces of extinct nobles do not keep this important fact sufficiently in mind, and as the Palazzo Giustiniani is still let in furnished lodgings, and it is quite possible that some of my readers may be going to spend next summer in it, I venture to remind them that if they have to draw somewhat upon their fancy for patrician accommodations there, it will cost them far less in money than it did the original proprietors, who contributed to our selfish pleasure by the very thought of their romantic absence and picturesque decay. In fact, the past is everywhere like the cake of proverb. You cannot enjoy it and have it. And here I am reminded of another pleasure of modern dwellers in Venetian palaces, which could hardly have been indulged by the patricians of old, and which is hardly imaginable by people of this day whose front doors open upon dry land. I mean to say the privilege of sea-bathing from one's own threshold. From the beginning of June till far into September, all the canals of Venice are populated by the amphibious boys who clamour about in the brine, or poise themselves for a leap from the tops of bridges, or show their fine statuesque figures bronzed by the ardent sun against the facades of empty palaces, where they hover among the marble sculptures and meditate a headlong plunge. It is only the Venetian ladies, in fact, who do not share this healthful amusement. Fathers of families, like so many plump domestic drakes, lead forth their aquatic broods, teaching the little ones to swim by the aid of various floats, and delighting in the gambols of the larger ducklings. When the tide comes in fresh and strong from the sea, the water in the Grand Canal is pure and refreshing, and at these times it is a singular pleasure to leap from one's doorstep into the swift current, and spend half an hour very informally among one's neighbours there. The Venetian bathing dress is a mere sketch of the pantaloons of ordinary life, and when I used to stand upon our balcony and see some bearded head ducking me a polite salutation,
From a pair of broad brown shoulders that showed above the water, I was not always able to recognise my acquaintance, deprived of his factitious identity of clothes, but I always knew a certain stately consul general by a vast expanse of baldness upon the top of his head, and it must be owned, I think, that this form of social assembly was, with all its disadvantages, a novel and vivacious spectacle. The Venetian ladies, when they bathed, went to the Lido, or else to the bath-houses in front of the ducal palace, where they saturated themselves a good part of the day and drank coffee, and possibly gossiped. I think our balconies at the Palazzo Giustiniani were even better places to see the life of the Grand Canal from than the balcony of Casafalia, which we had just left. Here at least we had a greater stretch of canal, looking, as we could, up either side of its angle. Here, too, we had more gondola stations in sight, and as we were nearer the Rialto, there was more picturesque passing of the market boats. But if we saw more of this life, we did not see it in greater variety, for I think we had already exhausted this. There was a movement all night long. If I woke at 3 or 4 o'clock, and offered myself the novel spectacle of the canal at that hour, I saw the heavy-laden barges go by to the Rialto, with now and then also a good-sized coasting schooner, making lazily for the lagoons, with its ruddy fire already kindled for cooking the morning's meal, and looking very enviably cosy. After our own breakfast, we began to watch for the gondolas of the tourists of different nations, whom we came to distinguish at a glance. Then the boats of the various artisans went by, the carpenters, the masons, the plasterers, with those that sold fuel and vegetables and fruit and fish to any household that arrested them. From noon till 3 or 4 o'clock the canal was comparatively deserted, but before twilight it was thronged again by people riding out in their open gondolas to take the air after the day's fervour. After nightfall they ceased, till only at long intervals a solitary lamp stealing over the dark surface gave token of the movement of some gondola bent upon an errand that could not fail to seem mysterious, or fail to be matter-of-fact. We never wearied of this oft-repeated variety, nor of our balcony in any way, and when the moon shone in through the lovely arched window and sketched its exquisite outline on the floor, we were as happy as moonshine could make us. Were we otherwise content? As concerns Venice, it is very hard to say. I do not know that I shall ever be able to say with certainty. For all the entertainment it afforded us, it was a very lonely life, and we felt the sadness of the city in many fine and not instantly recognisable ways. Englishmen who lived there bade us beware of spending the whole year in Venice, which they declared apt to result in a morbid depression of the spirits. I believe they attributed this to the air of the place, but I think it was more than half owing to her mood, to her old ghostly aimless life. She was indeed a phantom of the past haunting our modern world, serene, inexpressibly beautiful, yet inscrutably and unspeakably sad. Remembering the charm that was in her, we often sigh for the renewal of our own vague life there, a shadow within the shadow, but remembering also her deep melancholy, an involuntary shiver creeps over us, and we are glad not to be there. Perhaps some of you who have spent a summer day or summer week in Venice do not recognise this feeling, but if you will remain there not 4 years as we did, but a year or 6 months even, it will ever afterwards be only too plain. All changes, all events were affected by the inevitable local melancholy. The day was as pensive amidst that populous silence as the night, the winter not more pathetic than the long, tranquil, lovely summer. We rarely sentimentalised consciously, and still more seldom openly, about the present state of Venice, as contrasted with her past glory. I am glad to say that we despised the conventional poetastery about her, but I believe that we had so far lived into sympathy with her that, whether we realised it or not, we took the tone of her dispiritedness, and assumed a part of the common experience of loss and of hopelessness. History, if you live where it was created, is a far subtler influence than you suspect, and I would not say how much Venetian history, amidst the monuments of her glory and the witness of her fall, had to do in secret and tacit ways with the prevailing sentiment of existence, which I now distinctly recognise to have been a melancholy one. No doubt this sentiment was deepened by every freshly added association with memorable places, and each fact, each great name and career, each strange tradition, as it arose out of the past for us and shed its pale lustre upon the present, touched us with a pathos which we could neither trace nor analyse.
I do not know how much the modern Venetians had to do with this impression, but something I have no question. They were then under Austrian rule, and in spite of much that was puerile and theatrical in it, there was something very affecting in their attitude of what may best be described as passive defiance. This alone made them heroic, but it also made them tedious. They rarely talked of anything but politics, and, as I have elsewhere said, they were very jealous to have everyone declare himself of their opinion. Hemmed in by this jealousy on one side, and a heavy and rebellious sense of the wrongful presence of the Austrian troops and the Austrian spies on the other, we forever felt dimly constrained by something, we could not say precisely what, and we only knew what when we went sometimes on a journey into free Italy and threw off the irksome caution we had maintained both as to patriotic and alien tyrants. This political misery circumscribed our acquaintance very much, and reduced the circle of our friendship to 3 or 4 families who were content to know our sympathies without exacting constant expression of them. So we learned to depend mainly upon passing Americans for our society. We hailed with rapture the arrival of a gondola distinguished by the easy hats of our countrymen and the pretty faces and pretty dresses of our countrywomen. It was in the days of our war, and talking together over its events, we felt a brotherhood with every other American. Of course, in these circumstances, we made thorough acquaintance with the people about us in the palace. The landlord had come somehow into a profitable knowledge of Anglo-Saxon foibles and susceptibilities, but his lodgings were charming, and I recognised the principle that it is not for literature to make its prey of any possibly conscious object. For this reason, I am likewise mostly silent concerning a certain attaché of the palace, the right-hand man and intimate associate of the landlord. He was the descendant of one of the most ancient and noble families of Italy, a family of popes and cardinals, of princes and ministers, which in him was diminished and tarnished in an almost inexplicable degree. He was not at all worldly wise, but he was a man of great learning, and of a capacity for acquiring knowledge I have never seen surpassed. He possessed, I think, not many shirts on earth, but he spoke 3 or 4 languages, and wrote very pretty sonnets in Italian and German. He was one of the friendliest and willingest souls living, and as generous as utter destitution can make a man. Yet he had a proper spirit, and valued himself upon his name. Sometimes he brought his great-grandfather to the palace, a brisk old gentleman in his 90s, who had seen the fall of the Republic and 3 other revolutions in Venice, but had contrived to keep a government pension through all, and now smiled with unabated cheerfulness upon a world which he seemed likely never to leave. The palace servants were 2, the gondolier and a sort of housekeeper, a handsome swarthy woman with beautiful white teeth and liquid black eyes. She was the mother of a pretty little boy who was going to bring himself up for a priest, and whose chief amusement was saying mimic masses to an imaginary congregation. She was perfectly statuesque and obliging, and we had no right, as lovers of the beautiful or as lodgers, to complain of her, whatever her faults might have been. As to the gondolier, who was a very important personage in our palatial household, he was a handsome, bashful, well-mannered fellow, with a good-natured blue eye and a neatly waxed moustache. He had been 10 years a soldier in the Austrian army, and was, from his own account and from all I saw of him, one of the least courageous men in the world. But then no part of the Austrian system tends to make men brave, and I could easily imagine that before it had done with one, it might give him reasons enough to be timid all the rest of his life. Pierrot had not very much to do, and he spent the greater part of his leisure in a sort of lazy flirtation with the women about the kitchen fire or in the gondola, in which he sometimes gave them the air. We always liked him. I should have trusted him in any sort of way except one that involved danger. It once happened that burglars attempted to enter our rooms, and Pierrot declared to us that he knew the men, but before the police he swore that he knew nothing about them. Afterwards he returned privately to his first assertion, and accounted for his conduct by saying that if he had borne witness against the burglars, he was afraid that their friends would jump on his back, saltarmi addosso, as he phrased it, in the dark, for by this sort of terrorism the poor and the wicked have long been bound together in Italy. Pierrot was a humorist in his dry way, and he made a jest of his own caution, but his favourite joke was, when he dressed himself with particular care, to tell the women that he was going to pay a visit to the Princess Clary, then the star of Austrian society. This mild pleasantry was repeated indefinitely, with never-failing effect. More interesting to us than all the rest was our own servant, Bettina, who came to us from a village on the mainland. She was very dark, so dark and so southern in appearance as to almost to verge upon the negro type, yet she bore the English-sounding name of Scarborough, and how she ever came by it remains a puzzle to this day, for she was one of the most pure and entire of Italians. I mean, this was her maiden name. She married a trumpeter in the Austrian service, whose Bohemian name she was unable to pronounce, and consequently never gave us. She was a woman of very few ideas indeed, but perfectly honest and good-hearted. She was pious in her peasant fashion, and in her walks about the city did not fail to bless the baby before every picture of the Madonna. She provided it with an engraved portrait of the Holy Nail, which was venerated in the neighbouring church of San Pantaleon, and she apparently aimed to supply it with playthings of a religious and saving character, like that piece of ivory which resembled a small torso, which Bettina described as a bit of the Lord, signor, and it was, in fact, a fragment of an ivory crucifix, which she had somewhere picked up. To Bettina's mind, mankind broadly divided themselves into two races, Italians and Germans, to which latter she held that we Americans in some sort belonged. She believed that America lay a little to the south of Vienna, and in her heart I think she was persuaded that the real national complexion was black, and that the innumerable white Americans she saw at our house were merely a multitude of exceptions. But with all her ignorance she had no superstitions of a gloomy kind. The only ghost she seemed ever to have heard of was the spectre of an American ship captain, which a friend of Piero's had seen at the Lido. She was perfectly kind and obedient, and was deeply attached in an inarticulate way to the baby, which was indeed the pet of the whole palace. This young lady ruled arbitrarily over them all, and was forever being kissed and adored. When Piero went out to the wine-shop for a little temperate dissipation, he took her with him on his shoulder, and exhibited her to the admiring gondoliers of his acquaintance. There was no puppet show, no church festival in that region to which she was not carried, and when Bettina and Giulia and all the idle women of the neighbourhood assembled on a Saturday afternoon in the narrow alley behind the palace, where they dressed one another's thick black hair in fine braids soaked in milk, and built it up to last the whole of the next week, the baby was the cynosure of all hearts and eyes. But her supremacy was yet more distinguished when, late at night, the household gave itself a feast of snails, stewed in oil and garlic, in the vast kitchen. There her anxious parents have found her seated in the middle of the table, with the bowl of snails before her, and armed with a great spoon, while her vassals sat round and grinned their fondness and delight in her small tyrannies, and the immense room, dimly lit, with the mystical implements of cookery glimmering from the wall, showed like some witch's cavern, where a particularly small sorceress was presiding over the concoction of an evil potion, or the weaving of a powerful spell. From time to time we had fellow lodgers, who were always more or less interesting and mysterious. Among the rest there was once a French lady, who languished, during her stay, under the disfavour of the police, and for whose sake there was a sentinel with a fixed bayonet stationed day and night at the palace gate. At last, one night, this French lady escaped by a rope ladder from her chamber window, and thus no doubt satisfied alike the female instinct for intrigue and elopement, and the political agitator's love of a mysterious disappearance. It was understood dimly that she was an author, and had written a book displeasing to the police. Then there was the German Baroness and her son and daughter, the last very beautiful and much courted by handsome Austrian officers, the son rather weak-minded, and a great care to his sister and mother, from his propensity to fall in love and marry below his station. The mother very red-faced and fat, a good-natured old creature who gambled the summer months away at Homburg and Baden, and in the winter resorted to Venice to make a match for her pretty daughter. Then, moreover, there was that English family between whom and ourselves there was the reluctance and antipathy, personal and national, which exists between all right-minded Englishmen and Americans. No Italian can understand this just and natural condition, and it was the constant aim of our landlord to make us acquainted. So one day, when he found a member of each of these unfriendly families on the neutral ground of the Grand Sala, he introduced them. They had, happily, the pianoforte between them, and I flatter myself that the insulting coldness and indifference with which they received each other's names carried to our landlord's bosom a dismay never before felt by a good-natured and well-meaning man. The pianoforte, which I have mentioned, belonged to the landlord, who was fond of music and of all fine and beautiful things, and now and then he gave a musical soirée, which was attended more or less surreptitiously by the young people of his acquaintance. I do not think he was always quite candid in giving his invitations, for on one occasion a certain count, who had taken refuge from the glare of the sala in our parlour for the purpose of concealing the very loud plaided pantaloons he wore, explained pathetically that he had no idea it was a party, and that he had been so long out of society for patriotic reasons that he had no longer a dress suit. But to us they were very delightful entertainments, no less from the great variety of character they afforded than from the really charming and excellent music which the different amateurs made, for we had airs from all the famous operas, and the instrumentation was by a gifted young composer. Besides, the gaiety seemed to recall in some degree the old brilliant life of the palace, and at least showed us how well it was adapted to social magnificence and display. We enjoyed our whole year at Palazzo Giustiniani, though some of the days were too long and some too short, as everywhere. From heat we hardly suffered at all, so perfectly did the vast and lofty rooms answer to the purpose of their builders in this respect. A current of sea air drew through to the painter's garden by day, and by night there was scarcely a mosquito of the myriads that infested some parts of Venice. In winter it was not so well. Then we shuffled about in wadded gowns and boots lined with sheepskin, the woolly side in, as in the song. The passage of the Sala was something to be dreaded, and we shivered as fleetly through it as we could, and were all the colder for the deceitful warmth of the colours which the sun cast upon the stone floor from the window opening on the court. I do not remember any one event of our life more exciting than the attempted burglary of which I have spoken. In a city where the police gave their best attention to political offenders, there were naturally a great many rogues, and the Venetian rogues, if not distinguished for the more heroic crimes, were very skilful in what I may call the genre branch of robbing rooms through open windows, and committing all kinds of safe domestic depredations. It was judged best to acquaint justice, as they call law in Latin countries, with the attempt upon our property, and I found her officers housed in a small room of the Doge's palace, clerkly men in velvet skull-caps, driving loath quills over the rough official paper of those regions. After an exchange of diplomatic courtesies, the commissary took my statement of the affair down in writing, pertinent to which were my father's name, place, and business, with a full and satisfactory personal history of myself down to the period of the attempted burglary. This, I said, occurred one morning about daylight, when I saw the head of the burglar peering above the window-sill, and the hand of the burglar extended to prey upon my wardrobe. "Excuse me, Signor Console," interrupted the commissary. "How could you see him?" "Why, there was nothing in the world to prevent me. The window was open." "The window was open?" gasped the commissary. "Do you mean you sleep with your windows open?" "Most certainly." "Pardon?" said the commissary suspiciously. "Do all Americans sleep with their windows open?" "I may venture to say that they all do in summer," I answered. "At least, it's the general custom." Such a thing as this indulgence in fresh air seemed altogether foreign to the commissary's experience, and but for my official dignity, I am sure that I should have been effectually browbeaten by him. As it was, he threw himself back in his armchair and stared at me fixedly for some moments. Then he recovered himself with another "Perdoni," and, turning to his clerk, said, "Write that down. According to the American custom, they were sleeping with their windows open." But I know that the commissary, for all his politeness, considered this habit a relic of the times when we Americans all abode in wigwams, and I suppose it paralysed his energies in the effort to bring the burglars to justice, for I have never heard anything of them from that day to this. The truth is, it was a very uneventful year, and I am the better satisfied with it as an average Venetian year on that account. We sometimes varied the pensive monotony by a short visit to the cities of the mainland, but we always came back to it willingly, and I think we unconsciously abhorred any interruption of it. The days, as they followed each other, were wonderfully alike in every respect. For 8 months of summer they were alike in their clear-skied, sweet-breathed loveliness in the autumn. There, where the melancholy of the falling leaf could not spread its contagion to the sculptured foliage of Gothic art, the days were alike in their sentiment of tranquil oblivion and resignation, which was as autumnal as any aspect of woods or fields could have been. In the winter they were alike in their dreariness and discomfort. As I remember, we spent by far the greater part of our time in going to the piazza, and we were devoted Florianisti, as the Italians call those who lounge habitually at the Café Florian. We went every evening to the piazza as a matter of course. If the morning was long, we went to the piazza. If we did not know what to do with the afternoon, we went to the piazza. If we had friends with us, we went to the piazza. If we were alone, we went to the piazza. There was no mood or circumstances in which it did not seem a natural and fitting thing to go to the piazza. There were all the prettiest shops. There were all the finest cafes. There was the incomparable Church of St. Mark. There was the whole world of Venice. Of course, we had other devices besides going to the piazza, and sometimes we spent entire weeks in visiting churches, one after another, and studying their artistic treasures, down to the smallest scrap of an old master in their darkest chapel, their history, their storied tombs, their fictitious associations. Very few churches escaped, I believe, except such as had been turned into barracks and were guarded by an incorruptible Austrian sentinel. For such churches as did escape, we have a kind of envious longing to this day, and should find it hard to like anybody who had succeeded better in visiting them. There is, for example, the Church of San Giobbe, the doors of which we haunted with more patience than that of the titulary saint. Now the sacristan was out, now the church was shut up for repairs, now it was Holy Week and the pictures were veiled. We had to leave Venice at last without a sight of San Giobbe's three Saints of Bourdon and Madonna by Bellini, which unseen outvalue all the other saints and Madonnas that we looked at, and I am sure that life can never become so aimless, but we shall still have the desire of some day going to see the Church of San Giobbe. If we'd read some famous episode of Venetian history, we made it the care of our lives to visit the scene of its occurrence. If Ruskin told us of some recondite beauty of sculpture hid away in some unthought-of palace court, we invaded that palace at once. If in entirely purposeless strolls through the city we came upon anything that touched the fancy or piqued curiosity, there was no gate or bar proof against our bribes. What strange old nests of ruin, what marvellous homes of solitude and dilapidation did we not wander into? What boarded-up windows peer through, what gloomy recesses penetrate? I have lumber enough in my memory stored from such rambles to load the nightmares of a generation, and stuff for the dreams of a whole people. Does any gentleman or lady wish to write a romance? Sir or madam, I know just the mouldy and sunless alley for your villain to stalk his victim in, the canal in which to plunge his body, the staircase and hall for the subsequent wanderings of his ghost, and all these scenes and localities I will sell at half the cost price, as also balconies for flotation, gondolas for intrigue and elopement, confessionals for the betrayal of guilty secrets. I have an assortment of bad and beautiful faces, and picturesque attitudes, and effective tones of voice, and a large stock of sympathetic sculptures and furniture and dresses, with other articles too numerous to mention, all warranted Venetian, and suitable to every style of romance. Who bids? Nay, I cannot sell, nor you buy. Each memory, as I hold it up for inspection, loses its subtle beauty and value, and turns common and poor in my hawker's fingers. Yet I must needs try to fix here the remembrance of 2 or 3 palaces, of which our fancy took the fondest hold, and to which it yet most fondly clings. I cannot locate them all, and least of all can it place that vast old palace somewhere near Cannaregio, which faced upon a campo, with lofty windows blinded by rough boards, and empty from top to bottom. It was of the latter Renaissance in style, and we imagined it built in the Republic's declining years by some ruinous noble, whose extravagance forbade his posterity to live in it, for it had that peculiarly forlorn air which belongs to a thing decayed, without being worn out. We entered its coolness and dampness, and wandered up the wide marble staircase, past the vacant niches of departed statuary, and came on the 3rd floor to a grand portal, which was closed against us by a barrier of lumber. But this could not hinder us from looking within, and we were aware that we stood upon the threshold of our ruinous noble's great banqueting hall, where he used to give his magnificent feste de ballo. Lustrissimo was long gone with all his guests, but there in the roof were the amazing frescoes of Tiepolo's school, which had smiled down on them as they now smiled on us, great piles of architecture, airy tops of palaces swimming in the summer sky, and wantoned over by a joyous populace of divinities of the lovelier sex, that had nothing but their loveliness to clothe them and keep them afloat. The whole grandiose and superb, beyond the effect of words, and luminous with delicate colour. How it all rioted there with its inextinguishable beauty, in the solitude and silence, from day to day, from year to year, while men died and systems passed, and nothing remained unchanged but the instincts of youth and love that inspired it. It was music and wine and wit. It was so warm and glowing that it made the sunlight cold, and it seemed ever after a secret of gladness and beauty that the sad old palace was keeping in its heart against the time to which Venice looks forward, when her splendour and opulence shall be indestructibly renewed. There is a ballroom in the Palazzo Pisani, which some of my readers may have passed through on their way to the studio of the charming old Prussian painter, Nerli. The frescoes of this are dim and faded and dusty, and impress you with a sense of irreparable decay, but the noble proportions and princely air of the place are inalienable, while the palace stands. Here might have danced the Contarini who, when his wife's necklace of pearls fell upon the floor, in the way of her partner, the King of Denmark, advanced and ground it into powder with his foot, that the king might not be troubled to avoid treading on it. And here, doubtless, many a gorgeous masquerade had been in the long Venetian carnival, and what passion and intrigue and jealousy, who knows? Now the palace was let in apartments, and was otherwise a barrack, and in the great court, steadfast as any of the marble statues, stood the Austrian sentinel. One of the statues was a figure veiled from head to foot, at the base of which it was hard not to imagine lovers masked and hooded, and forever hurriedly whispering their secrets in the shadow cast in perpetual moonlight. Yet another ballroom in yet another palace opens to memory, but this is all bright and fresh with recent decoration. In the blue vaulted roof shine stars of gold. The walls are gay with dainty frescoes. A gallery encircles the whole, and from this drops a light stairway, slim-railed, and guarded at the foot by torch-bearing statues of swarthy Eastern girls. Through the glass doors at the other side glimmers the green and red of a garden. It was a place to be young in, to dance in, dream in, make love in, but it was no more a surprise than the whole palace to which it belonged, and which there, in that tattered and poverty-stricken old Venice, was a vision of untarnished splendour and prosperous fortune. It was richly furnished throughout all its vast extent, adorned with every caprice and delight of the art, and appointed with every modern comfort. The foot was hushed by costly carpets, the eye was flattered by 1,000 beauties and prettinesses. In the grates the fires were laid and ready to be lighted, the candles stood upon the mantels, the toilet linen was arranged for instant use in the luxurious chambers. But from the basement to the roof the palace was a solitude. No guest came there, and no one dwelt there save the custodian, the eccentric lady of whose possessions it formed a part abode in a little house behind the palace, and on her doorplate had written her Vanite Vanitatum in the sarcastic inscription, John Humdrum, Esquire. Of course she was Inglese, and that other lady who was selling off the furniture of her palace, and was so amiable a guide to its wonders in her curious broken English, was Hungarian. Her great pride and joy amidst the objects of virtu and works of art was a set of punch which she made us admire, and which she prized the more because she had always been allowed to receive it when the government prohibited it to everybody else. But we were Americans, she said. And had we ever seen this book? She held up the Potiphar Papers, a volume which must have been inexpressibly amused and bewildered to find itself there in that curious little old lady's hand. Shall I go on and tell of the palace in which our strange friend, Padre L., dwelt, and the rooms of which he had filled up with the fruits of his passion for the arts and sciences, the ante-rooms he had frescoed to represent a grape arbour, with a multitude of clusters overhead, the parlour with his oil paintings on the walls, and the piano and melodeon, arranged so that Padre L. could play upon them both at once, the oratory turned forward, and harbouring the most alchemic-looking apparatus of all kinds, the other rooms in which he had stored his inventions in portable furniture, steam propulsion, rifled cannon, and perpetual motion, the attic with the camera by which one could photograph oneself. Shall I tell of this, and yet other palaces? I think there is enough already, and I have begun to doubt somewhat the truth of my reminiscences, as I advise the reader to do. Besides, I feel the words fail to give all the truth that is in them, and if I cannot make them serve my purpose as to the palaces, how should I hope to impart through them my sense of the glory and loveliness of Venetian art? I could not give the imagination and the power of Tintoretto, as we felt it, nor the serene beauty, the gracious luxury of Titian, nor the opulence, the worldly magnificence of Paolo Veronese. There hang their mighty works forever. High above the reach of any palaverer, they smile their stately welcome from the altars and palace walls upon whoever approaches them in the sincerity and love of beauty that produced them, and thither you must thus go, if you would know them. Like fragments of dreams, like fleeting images of glimmering dawn, I am from time to time aware, amid the workday world, of some happiness from them, some face or form, some drift of a princely robe or ethereal drapery, some august shape of painted architecture, some unnameable delight of colour. But to describe them more strictly and explicitly, how should I undertake? There was the exhaustion following every form of intense pleasure in their contemplation, such a wear of vision and thought that I could not call the life we led in looking at them an idle one, even if it had no result in after times. So I will not say that it was to severer occupation our minds turned more and more in our growing desire to return home. For my own part, personally, I felt keenly the fictitious and transitionary character of official life. I knew that if I had become fit to serve the government by 4 years' residence in Venice, that was a good reason why the government, according to our admirable system, should dismiss me and send some perfectly unqualified person to take my place, and in my heart also I knew that there was almost nothing for me to do where I was, and I dreaded the easily formed habit of receiving a salary for no service performed. I reminded myself that soon or late I must go back to the old fashion of earning money, and that it had better be sooner rather than later. Therefore, though for some reasons it was the saddest and strangest thing in the world to do, I was on the whole rejoiced when a leave of absence came and we prepared to quit Venice. Never had the city seemed so dreamlike and unreal as in this light of farewell, this tearful glimmer which our love and regret cast upon it. As in a maze, we haunted once more, and for the last time, the scenes we had known so long, and spent our final phantasmal evening in the piazza, looked through the moonlight, our mute adieu to the islands and lagoons, to church and tower, and then returned to our own palace, and stood long upon the balconies that overhung the Grand Canal. There the future became as incredible and improbable as the past, and if we had often felt the incongruity of our coming to live in such a place now with tenfold force, we felt the cruel absurdity of proposing to live anywhere else. We had become part of Venice, and how could such atoms of her fantastic personality ever mingle with the alien and unsympathetic world? The next morning the whole palace household bestirred itself to accompany us to the station, the landlord in his best hat and coat, our noble friend in phenomenal linen, Giulia and her little boy, Bettina shedding bitter tears over the baby, and Piero, sad but firm, bending over the oar and driving us swiftly forward. The first turn of the canal shut the Palazzo Giustiniani from our lingering gaze. A few more curves and windings brought us to the station. The tickets were bought, the baggage was registered. The little oddly assorted company drew itself up in a line and received with tears our husky adieu. I feared there might be a remote purpose in the hearts of the landlord and his retainer to embrace and kiss me after the Italian manner, but if there was, by final inspiration, they spared me the ordeal. Piero turned away to his gondola. The two other men moved aside. Bettina gave one long, hungering, devouring hug to the baby, and as we hurried into the waiting room, we saw her, as upon the stage, standing without the barrier, supported and sobbing in the arms of Giulia. It was well to be gone, but I cannot say we were glad to be going. End of chapter 22. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia. End of Venetian Life by William Dean Howells.